I found my daughter broken in the woods, barely breathing. As I held her battered body, she pulled me close and whispered it was Sarah. She said, "We do not belong." My hands started shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, calculated rage. I carried her to my truck and texted my brother Thomas. "It is our turn. Time for what Dad taught us. They are going to pay." Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family. My name is Jerome. I am 69 years old. The Connecticut woods were freezing that Tuesday evening. The damp air cut through my thick flannel jacket, but the chill in my bones came from the scene in front of me. The GPS tracker on Jessica's phone led me off the main highway deep into a private forested area owned by her husband's family. I parked my old truck by the tree line and ran into the thick brush. That is when I saw her. She was lying against a rotting oak tree. Her expensive designer coat was torn and soaked in dark red blood. Her face was bruised and swollen almost beyond recognition. I dropped to my knees, the wet mud soaking through my jeans. I gathered her into my arms, supporting her neck. Her shallow breathing tore my heart into pieces. Her eyes fluttered open, looking at me with pure terror. "Dad," she choked out, blood staining her lips. "I am here, baby," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I got you." She grabbed my collar with a weak, trembling hand and whispered the words that would ignite a war. "It was Sarah." She said, "We definitely do not belong here." I did not scream. Screaming is for people who panic. Panic gets you killed. 40 years in the forensic accounting trenches dealing with cartel ledgers and mafia shell corporations taught me how to breathe when the room is on fire. My calloused hands moved with absolute precision. I took off my heavy flannel jacket and pressed it firmly against the deepest wound on her side to stop the heavy bleeding. The fabric turned crimson instantly, but I applied more pressure. "Hold on, Jessica," I murmured, smoothing her matted hair away from her bruised forehead. "Just keep looking at me, baby." She let out a weak groan as I lifted her. Despite my age, my arms were still strong enough to carry my entire world. She felt so light, too fragile. I navigated back through the dense brush, carefully avoiding the jagged branches that could hurt her further. My mind was working at 1,000,000 miles an hour, evaluating every variable. I knew I could not call 911 right now. This stretch of Connecticut was practically owned by Sarah and her real estate empire. The local police chief attended their holiday galas and drank their expensive imported whiskey. Calling the cops meant alerting the very people who wanted my daughter dead. I reached the truck and managed to open the passenger door, placing her gently onto the worn seat. I grabbed the emergency first aid kit I always kept behind the driver's side, wrapping a compression bandage tight around her torso. She whimpered and her eyes rolled back into her head. "Stay with me," I commanded, my voice echoing in the quiet woods. I slammed the door shut and climbed into the driver's seat. Blood coated my palms, making the steering wheel slick. Before I turned the ignition key, I pulled out my phone. My hands were finally steady. I opened my messages and tapped on the contact from my younger brother, Thomas. We had not spoken much since our wives passed away, but blood is thicker than silence. I typed out a quick message. "They hurt my girl. Meet me at the county hospital immediately. It is our turn. Time for what Dad taught us." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the dashboard. I fired up the engine and the old Ford roared to life, tearing out of the dirt path and onto the paved road. The tires screeched as I pushed the pedal down hard. Every second counted. I kept glancing over at Jessica, praying her chest would keep rising and falling. I was driving toward the hospital, but my brain was already plotting a devastating counterattack. Sarah thought she could discard us like trash. She thought an old black man from the city would just bow his head and weep while she swept her crimes under the rug. She picked the wrong family to mess with. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. They were going to regret the day they touched her. My late wife Evelyn and I spent 40 years breaking our backs to give Jessica a life we never had. Evelyn worked double shifts as a registered nurse while I untangled financial webs for federal task forces. We poured every dime into her education, making sure she graduated at the top of her class from an Ivy League university. She was brilliant, compassionate, and completely oblivious to the inherent cruelty of the elite circles she eventually entered. When she brought Ethan home, I saw the warning signs immediately. He was charming, wealthy, and entirely dependent on his mother, Sarah. Sarah was the matriarch of a sprawling real estate empire built on generational wealth and silent prejudices. At their lavish wedding, Sarah wore an icy smile, and made a point to seat Evelyn and me at the very back of the banquet hall near the kitchen doors. She introduced us to her wealthy white friends as Jessica's urban relatives, using a tone dripping with condescension. We swallowed our pride for our daughter. We smiled and nodded, playing the part of the humble, grateful guests simply because Jessica looked so incredibly happy. But behind closed doors, Sarah constantly undermined her. She mocked Jessica's natural hair, criticized her career ambitions, and constantly reminded her that she was an outsider who should consider herself lucky to be allowed into their flawless, pristine bloodline. I should have intervened sooner. I should have pulled her away from that toxic environment the moment I saw Sarah sneer. Instead, I trusted my daughter to handle it. That mistake had left her bleeding out on my passenger seat. Evelyn would never forgive me for letting this happen. I would never forgive myself either until I dismantled Sarah entirely tonight. The hospital emergency entrance finally appeared directly in my view. I hit the brakes, preparing to turn into the ambulance bay, when flashing red and blue lights suddenly blinded me. 3 local police cruisers aggressively blocked the hospital driveway, cutting off my path entirely. Before I could even put the truck into park, 4 officers jumped out of their vehicles. They did not walk over to ask if there was a medical emergency. They drew their weapons immediately, leveling their guns straight at my windshield. "Step out of the vehicle and keep your hands where we can see them," a young officer shouted over a megaphone. His voice was laced with an aggressive hostility that made my stomach drop. "Turn off the engine right now, old man." I looked at Jessica, whose breathing was growing dangerously faint, and then back at the officers. "My daughter is dying," I yelled through the cracked window. "She needs a doctor right now." "Shut your mouth, Jerome," another officer barked, walking toward my door with his service weapon pointed directly at my head. "We received a frantic phone call from your son-in-law, Ethan. He reported that you kidnapped your daughter during a severe mental breakdown and brutally assaulted her in the woods. You are under arrest for aggravated assault and domestic violence. Sarah had set her trap." I stared down the barrel of the young officer's service weapon. My instinct, honed from years of dealing with dangerous men, screamed at me to fight back. But glancing at Jessica's pale face in the passenger seat, I knew any sudden movement would delay her medical treatment. She did not have minutes to spare. She barely had seconds. I raised both my hands, slowly spreading my blood-stained fingers wide to show I was completely unarmed. "I surrender," I shouted, keeping my voice deliberately calm and entirely non-threatening. "Just please get my daughter to a doctor. She is bleeding out. Do not let her die." The officers rushed forward. 2 of them yanked me out of the truck, slamming my chest against the cold metal of the door. They kicked my legs apart and violently cuffed my wrists behind my back. The steel bit into my skin, but I did not flinch. I did not care about the pain or the indignity of being pinned against my own vehicle like a common criminal. All my attention remained fixated on the hospital doors. As they aggressively patted me down, a team of paramedics finally sprinted out of the emergency room. They pulled Jessica from the truck, placing her onto a stretcher. I watched the paramedics frantically initiate life-saving measures, securing an oxygen mask over her bloody face and shouting urgent medical codes. Her arm dangled limply off the side of the stretcher, a stark contrast to the vibrant young woman she had always been. They rushed her through the sliding glass doors, disappearing into the blinding white lights of the trauma unit. I exhaled a slow, ragged breath, feeling a momentary wave of relief. She was safely in the hands of medical professionals now. My immediate priority was finally handled perfectly. Before the police could shove me into the back of their cruiser, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up violently against the hospital curb. The rear doors flew open and Sarah stepped out, followed closely by her son, Ethan. Sarah immediately launched into the most theatrical display of fake sorrow I had ever witnessed. She practically threw herself toward the police officers, weeping hysterically and clutching her pearl necklace. "Oh, my poor sweet daughter-in-law," Sarah wailed, her voice echoing across the parking lot. "Officer, please tell me she is going to survive. She has been suffering from such severe clinical depression lately. She has been totally out of her mind. She completely lost her grip on reality, slashed her own body in a manic episode, and ran off into the deep woods. We have been searching everywhere for her." The lead officer immediately lowered his defensive posture, completely buying into the wealthy white woman's fabricated narrative. "We got her inside, ma'am," he said respectfully. "We apprehended the suspect who took her." Sarah shot me a look of pure venom disguised as a tragic glance. Meanwhile, Ethan approached me with a seemingly comforting demeanor. He played the part of the grieving husband, flawlessly placing a heavy hand on my shoulder for the officers to see. But the moment the cops turned their attention back to his mother, Ethan dug his fingers viciously into the pressure points on my neck and shoulder. His grip was agonizingly tight, digging directly into a bruised nerve. "Listen to me very carefully, you worthless old man," Ethan whispered into my ear, his breath hot and reeking of expensive scotch. "You are going to sign a medical power of attorney granting me full authority over Jessica's healthcare decisions right now. If you refuse, I swear I will make sure you rot in a state penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life for aggravated domestic abuse and attempted murder." He slipped a crumpled legal document and a pen from his jacket pocket, pressing them forcefully against my handcuffed hands. "You will tell the hospital staff that I am in charge," Ethan continued, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "We are going to instruct the doctors to pull her life support. She is too unstable. It is the most merciful thing to do for her." The sheer audacity of his demand made my blood boil. They were openly plotting to murder my daughter by pulling the plug to ensure she could never wake up and expose their criminal enterprise. They were actively weaponizing the legal system to execute a hit right inside the hospital. Ethan twisted my shoulder harder, attempting to force a physical submission out of me. "Sign the paper, Jerome," he threatened, pressing the pen against my bound fingers. "Do it before the police decide you are resisting arrest and put a bullet in your chest." The officers were too captivated by Sarah's masterful performance to notice Ethan physically coercing me in the shadows. I looked at the legal document in his hand, realizing the absolute depth of their depravity. They wanted to legally authorize her death today. I knew exactly how the world viewed a man like me in this specific scenario. To Sarah and Ethan, I was just a tired, defeated old black man from the inner city who had overstepped his boundaries. They assumed I possessed no leverage, no resources, and absolutely no intellectual capacity to challenge their inherited generational power. So I deliberately gave them exactly the reaction they anticipated to satisfy their massive egos and completely lower their guard. I slumped my shoulders forward, allowing my knees to tremble slightly as if the weight of their immense wealth and influence was entirely crushing my spirit. I dropped my gaze to the wet pavement, refusing to make direct eye contact, playing the role of the subjugated victim perfectly. "Please, Ethan," I stammered intentionally, letting my voice crack with manufactured fear. "Please just let me see my little girl one last time. I will do whatever you want. I will sign anything you put in front of me. Just please do not hurt me anymore." Ethan smirked, a disgusting expression of absolute triumph spreading across his privileged face. He practically shoved the document into my bound hands, believing he had successfully broken me. He had no idea that beneath my submissive exterior, a methodical forensic accountant was already analyzing every variable of his incoming destruction. For 4 decades, I had dismantled crime syndicates, billionaires, and corrupt politicians by tracing their dirty money. I never fought with my fists because fists were temporary. I fought with tax codes, audit trails, and federal indictments because those weapons could completely eradicate a bloodline. By playing the terrified old fool, I successfully made Ethan drop his guard completely. They stupidly thought they were hunting a weak lamb, but they had actually just cornered a highly dangerous and patient wolf. The officers finally grabbed my arms, roughly pulling me away from the treacherous mother and son duo. They marched me toward the sliding automatic doors of the emergency room entrance to process my arrest inside. As we walked past the chaotic triage intake desk, a frantic nurse accidentally knocked over a plastic medical waste bin. A flurry of drafted intake papers and preliminary lab results scattered across the sterile linoleum floor right at my boots. My eyes darted downward. I recognized my daughter's name printed boldly across a crumpled preliminary toxicology report. Without hesitating, I deliberately stumbled forward, pretending my old legs had simply given out. The officers cursed loudly, losing their grip on me for a fraction of a second. I hit the floor hard, but my cuffed hands blindly swiped the crumpled paper, sliding it seamlessly up my long flannel sleeve. "Get up, old man," the officer barked, hauling me back onto my feet. I apologized profusely, keeping my head down. As they shoved me into a holding room, I carefully unrolled the stolen document with my bound fingers. The printed text confirmed a horrific nightmare. High levels of a synthetic neurotoxin were actively circulating in Jessica's bloodstream. They had not just beaten her. They had absolutely and forcefully poisoned her first tonight. I sat in that sterile holding room staring at the damning toxicology report when the heavy metal door suddenly swung open. The young officer who had shoved me to the floor earlier stumbled backward, looking genuinely terrified. Stepping through the doorway was my younger brother Thomas. At 67 years old, Thomas still possessed the intimidating physical presence of a man who had spent 3 decades kicking down doors for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was wearing his faded leather jacket and holding up a tarnished but highly official-looking federal badge directly in the face of the local cop. "You local boys really stepped in it this time," Thomas barked, his voice booming with absolute authority. "This man is a key asset in an ongoing federal investigation, and you just violated federal protocol by detaining him without clearance." The young cop stammered, trying to explain about the domestic violence call from Ethan, but Thomas cut him off instantly. "You take your fake domestic violence report and you shove it," Thomas commanded, stepping closer and forcing the cop to retreat further into the hallway. "You uncuff my brother right now, or I will have the Department of Justice crawling so far up your precinct you will all be writing parking tickets until you retire." The sheer confidence and aggressive bureaucratic jargon worked flawlessly. These corrupt small-town cops were terrified of federal oversight. The officer quickly fumbled with his keys and unlocked the cold steel cuffs from my wrists. My arms dropped to my sides, aching and stiff, but I immediately secured the crumpled toxicology report deep inside my pocket. Thomas grabbed my shoulder, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. "Let us get out of this holding cell, Jerome," he said loudly. We walked right past the stunned officers. We moved quickly through the chaotic emergency room corridors, entirely avoiding the main lobby where Sarah and Ethan were still putting on their disgusting theatrical performance for the authorities. Thomas guided me toward a restricted maintenance stairwell that smelled heavily of bleach and old floor wax. The moment the heavy fire door clicked shut behind us, enclosing us in absolute silence, Thomas reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a modified military-grade tablet. He did not ask how Jessica was doing because he could already see the blood covering my clothes and the absolute murderous intent burning in my eyes. "We need to erase you, picking up that toxicology report," Thomas whispered, his fingers flying across the tablet screen with the speed of a seasoned cyber warfare operative. "If Sarah finds out you have physical proof of the poison, she will accelerate whatever sick endgame she has planned for your daughter." I leaned against the cold concrete wall, watching my brother bypass the outdated hospital security firewall in less than 40 seconds. Thomas had spent his entire career erasing digital footprints for undercover agents deep inside hostile territories. Erasing a 10-second clip from a rural hospital server was child play for him. The screen displayed the triage desk camera feed showing the exact moment the nurse knocked over the waste bin and my handcuffed hands swiftly swiping the crumpled paper from the floor. Thomas hit a few commands, and the footage glitched smoothly, replacing the missing seconds with a perfectly looped frame of the empty hallway. "It is done," Thomas said, closing the tablet and looking me dead in the eye. "They have no idea you know about the neurotoxin. Now tell me what the hell we are dealing with here, Jerome." I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket, smoothing it out under the dim stairwell light. "They did not just beat her, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low register. "They injected her with a highly concentrated synthetic neurotoxin before they staged the physical assault in the woods. They wanted her brain dead so Ethan could invoke the medical power of attorney and pull the plug legally." Thomas clenched his jaw, his fist tightening until his knuckles turned completely white. "Sarah and Ethan just declared a war they cannot possibly win," he growled. "We are going to completely dismantle their entire empire block by block." I nodded, my mind already shifting into the calculating analytical state that had made me a legend in my field. "I need to get to the house immediately," I told him. "If they tried to murder her tonight, they are definitely scrubbing her personal safe right now to destroy whatever evidence she originally found." Thomas tossed me a spare set of car keys. "Take my unmarked sedan parked out back," he instructed. "I will stay here and physically guard the intensive care unit. If Sarah tries to get near her, I will break her legs." I caught the keys. I gripped the keys tightly and slipped out through the hospital loading dock into the freezing night air. Sarah and Ethan honestly believed they were dealing with a naive retired mechanic or some helpless grandfather they could easily intimidate into submission. They did not do their research. For 4 uninterrupted decades before my quiet retirement, I served as the chief forensic accountant for a joint federal task force operating out of the tri-state area. My specific job was to meticulously track the invisible flow of illicit cartel money moving through legitimate corporate real estate ventures. I did not carry a gun or kick down doors like Thomas did. My weapons were infinitely more destructive. I dismantled powerful billionaires, corrupt senators, and ruthless drug kingpins using audit trails, tax discrepancies, and asset forfeiture laws. I knew exactly how elite criminals hid their dirty money behind pristine corporate facades because I was the man the government explicitly paid to find it. My beloved wife Evelyn and I deliberately chose to live a quiet, exceptionally modest lifestyle to protect Jessica from the dangerous enemies I made during my long career. We intentionally drove old trucks, lived in a deeply unpretentious neighborhood, and allowed people like Sarah to assume we were financially destitute. That assumption was their most fatal error. I possessed a mind built entirely for hunting financial anomalies and uncovering carefully buried secrets. As I drove Thomas' unmarked sedan through the dark, winding streets toward Ethan and Jessica's massive estate, I mentally prepared myself to step back into the violent arena I thought I had left behind forever. I was no longer just a grieving father rushing to desperately save his daughter. I was the Reaper coming to aggressively audit their entire corrupt existence tonight and collect my extremely bloody payment. I parked the sedan 3 blocks away from the sprawling gated estate, ensuring my approach remained entirely undetected in the shadows. Using a set of lockpicks I had carried for years, I silently bypassed the rear kitchen door in seconds. The massive house was eerily dark, but faint beams of light flickered from the second-floor home office. I drew a compact tactical flashlight from my pocket and crept up the grand sweeping staircase, my footsteps making absolutely zero sound on the plush, expensive carpet. When I reached the doorway, I peered cautiously around the thick wooden frame. My stomach instantly dropped into an icy abyss. The heavy steel door of the hidden wall safe had been completely blown open using an industrial thermal torch. Standing right in the middle of the room, illuminated by the glow of a small desk lamp, was Sarah. She was rapidly stuffing stacks of bound documents, offshore banking tokens, and velvet jewelry boxes into a large leather duffel bag. Standing casually beside her, sipping a glass of stolen bourbon, was the powerfully built local chief of police. They were actively liquidating the personal assets, while she tragically fought for her life in surgery. Then Sarah said something that absolutely froze my angry blood completely cold tonight without warning. "Make sure the little girl did not upload those offshore account ledgers to some secure cloud," Sarah said, her voice dripping with malicious intent. "I swear to God, Chief, if that pathetic old father of hers gets his hands on our financial records, I will have you personally butcher him." The police chief chuckled darkly, setting his bourbon glass on Jessica's polished mahogany desk. "Do not worry about Jerome," he replied arrogantly. "My boys have him dead to rights on aggravated assault. He will be rotting in a holding cell by morning, and your problem will be completely erased." I realized instantly that standing in the hallway was a tactical error that could cost me my life and my daughter her only chance at justice. I needed absolute concealment to gather the intelligence they were freely spilling. I silently backed away from the doorframe and looked up. The grand estate possessed an outdated drop-ceiling ventilation system spanning the second-floor corridors. With the stealth and precision I had maintained during decades of undercover field operations, I stepped quietly onto a heavy decorative credenza positioned against the wall. I reached up and carefully pushed aside a wide acoustic ceiling tile. I hoisted my 69-year-old frame into the dark, cramped crawl space above the drywall, ignoring the severe burn of arthritis in my shoulders. I pulled my legs up and slid the tile perfectly back into place just as the heavy office door swung open. The police chief stepped out, scanning the dark hallway with a tactical flashlight. I held my breath suspended directly above his head, surrounded by thick dust and fiberglass insulation. The beam of light swept the carpet directly below me but found nothing. I remained completely silent and perfectly hidden in the shadows above. The chief walked back into the office, leaving the door slightly ajar. I pressed my ear flat against the cold metal of the ventilation duct snaking directly above their heads. The acoustic tile offered minimal soundproofing, allowing me to capture every vile syllable of their conversation with absolute clarity. Sarah began pacing the room, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "We need to expedite the transfer of those shell company assets to the Cayman accounts," she demanded. Jessica found the master ledger Ethan was too stupid to encrypt properly. She saw the routing numbers tied directly to the Sinaloa cartel distributions. The police chief let out a long, exasperated sigh. "I told you bringing that girl into your family was a massive liability, Sarah. She is too smart for her own good. You cannot run a $70 million real estate money laundering operation and leave your digital vault wide open for a curious wife to stumble upon. Ethan is weak, Sarah snapped back furiously. He got careless and left his laptop unlocked. Jessica confronted him yesterday, threatening to take the entire ledger directly to the federal authorities and file for a massive divorce settlement. She said she was going to expose our entire operation and burn my family legacy to the ground. That is when I knew she had to be permanently removed from the equation. I squeezed my eyes shut as the sickening reality of my child's suffering finally crystallized in my mind. Jessica had not been targeted simply because Sarah hated her racial background or her working-class origins. She was brutally targeted because she had accidentally uncovered the most dangerous financial conspiracy in the state. Sarah was using her pristine luxury real estate developments to aggressively wash tens of millions of dollars in illicit drug cash for ruthless cartels. Jessica had found the ultimate smoking gun and possessed the moral courage to blow the whistle on their entire syndicate. We handled it perfectly, Sarah continued, her voice devoid of any human empathy. The neurotoxin was brilliant. It mimics a severe psychotic break and causes massive internal hemorrhaging. We chased her into the woods, and Ethan finished the job with a steel pipe to ensure she looked like the victim of a wild manic episode. Once Ethan signs the medical directive to terminate her life support tomorrow morning, the only person who knows about the cartel money will be reduced to ashes in a crematorium. And what about the physical ledger, the chief asked. I am holding it right now, Sarah replied, the sound of heavy paper shuffling echoing up into the ceiling. I am going to shred this immediately and burn the remnants. We have already scrubbed the digital backups. Without this ledger, no federal agent or forensic accountant can ever prove the money laundering network exists. The cartel will be satisfied, and we can continue our operations without that self-righteous little girl interfering in our business. I successfully memorized every single critical and damning detail completely now. I knew I could not stay hidden above the office any longer. The shredder began violently grinding the master ledger into worthless confetti, destroying the only physical copy of their massive financial crimes. I had to extract myself immediately and formulate a completely different strategy to annihilate them. I slowly turned my body inside the cramped ventilation shaft. The narrow, galvanized steel duct was designed for airflow, not a broad-shouldered 69-year-old man. The interior surface was littered with exposed industrial screws, jagged sheet metal edges, and decades of accumulated toxic dust. I began dragging myself forward inch by agonizing inch, using only my elbows and the tips of my boots. A rusted screw tore deep into the flesh of my left shoulder, slicing through my flannel shirt and scraping directly against my collarbone. Warm blood instantly flowed down my back, but my iron discipline refused to let a single groan escape my lips. During my years infiltrating hostile environments, I learned that silence was the ultimate currency of survival. I clenched my jaw, swallowing the intense searing pain, and continued my slow, torturous crawl toward the exterior exhaust vent. Spiders and thick cobwebs coated my face, but I kept my breathing shallow and perfectly controlled. Every agonizing movement was fueled by the brutal memory of my daughter bleeding helplessly in the freezing woods. The pain in my shoulder was absolutely nothing compared to the violent agony they had inflicted upon Jessica. I finally reached the heavy iron grate overlooking the dark backyard. With one strong, calculated push, I silently dislodged the rusted metal covering and slipped out into the freezing night air, dropping flawlessly into the thick, overgrown bushes below. I was safely out of the dangerous mansion area, completely unseen and perfectly undetected tonight. I sprinted through the dark, affluent neighborhood, utilizing the heavy shadows of the manicured oak trees to mask my swift movement. I reached Thomas' unmarked sedan exactly where I had parked it 3 blocks away. I climbed into the driver's seat, clutching my bleeding shoulder, and sped aggressively across town toward my own modest home. If Sarah was actively destroying all the physical evidence of her massive cartel connections, she would definitely send operatives to eliminate any remaining loose ends immediately. I knew my humble house was highly vulnerable tonight. I parked 2 streets away and approached my front porch with extreme tactical caution. The front door was completely shattered, hanging violently off its hinges. My heart slammed fiercely against my ribcage. Thomas had promised to stay at the hospital, but he must have returned to secure our sensitive files. I silently drew a heavy wrench from my tool belt and crept into the darkened hallway. The living room furniture was overturned and completely destroyed. Standing right in the center of the debris was a towering man dressed entirely in black tactical gear. He was pressing the barrel of a heavily suppressed pistol directly against the back of Thomas' head, preparing to pull the lethal trigger instantly to end his life without any hesitation. I did not hesitate for a single second. The wrench in my hand felt too light for the damage I needed to inflict right now. I slowly lowered it to the floor and reached out to the heavy iron sledgehammer I always kept propped behind the front door for emergency home repairs. My shoulder burned fiercely from the deep cut I sustained in the ventilation shaft, but the adrenaline flooding my veins completely masked the pain. The towering man in black tactical gear stood with his back completely turned to me, his entire focus locked onto Thomas. He was speaking in a low, muffled voice, commanding my brother to get down on his knees. He had absolutely no idea the Reaper was standing right behind him. I raised the heavy sledgehammer high above my head, gripping the thick wooden handle with both of my calloused hands. I swung the massive iron head downward with every ounce of strength I possessed, aiming directly for the back of his right knee. The heavy metal made a sickening crunch as it completely shattered his joint. The hitman let out a horrific scream of pure agony, collapsing instantly to the ruined living room floor. Before he could even process the devastating blow or aim his suppressed weapon, Thomas spun around with the lethal speed of a seasoned federal agent. My brother viciously kicked the pistol out of the assassin grip, sending it sliding far across the hardwood floor. Thomas dropped his knee heavily onto the man's throat, pinning him firmly to the ground, while I stepped forward, keeping the bloody sledgehammer raised and ready for another strike. The giant hitman writhed in absolute torment, clutching his completely destroyed leg. We had neutralized the immediate lethal threat flawlessly and entirely without any hesitation whatsoever. Thomas stripped the hitman and zip-tied his wrists behind his back. He dug through his pockets, pulling out an encrypted smartphone and a leather wallet, tossing it directly to me. The hitman groaned loudly, his face pale from the shattered bone in his leg. "Who sent you?" Thomas demanded, pressing on his throat. The assassin gritted his teeth and spat blood onto the floor. "I am not telling you anything, old man," he hissed defiantly. I did not waste my time yelling or throwing punches. Physical torture was messy and yielded unreliable results. I preferred a sophisticated method of breaking a man. I opened his wallet, pulling out his driver's license and a black debit card. His name was Marcus. I walked over to the corner where my desktop computer had survived the struggle. I booted up the machine. Marcus watched with confused defiance as I logged into a specialized tracing network I used during my days hunting cartel ghost accounts. It took exactly 4 minutes to run his routing numbers through the secure backdoor database. "You think you are a ghost, Marcus," I said softly, my voice carrying a deadly calm. I tapped a few more keys, watching the data populate rapidly across my bright monitor. "You use a shell corporation to wash your contract fees, but you make one fundamental mistake. You constantly transfer clean funds to a small community bank in Oregon." I turned the monitor around so he could clearly see the glowing screen. The defiant smirk instantly vanished from his pale, sweating face. "That account belongs to your 72-year-old mother," I continued, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "She lives in an assisted living facility, relying entirely on the trust fund you built using blood money." The hitman began to struggle against the tight zip ties, his chest heaving with sheer panic. "Do not touch her," he yelled frantically. "She has nothing to do with this." I tapped my finger against the keyboard, hovering over the command. "I am a forensic accountant, Marcus. With one single keystroke, I can flag her account for federal money laundering and civil asset forfeiture. The government will freeze every penny. She will be violently evicted by tomorrow morning and thrown onto the freezing streets with absolutely nothing. You can save her right now or watch me erase her life." Thomas leaned down close to his ear. "My brother does not bluff," son Thomas whispered coldly. "Give us the name." The hitman stared at the screen, his tough exterior crumbling under the immense weight of absolute financial ruin. It was Sarah, he choked out, tears of genuine defeat streaming down his face. "Sarah paid me $50,000 in cash to execute both of you and stage it as a tragic home invasion. She wanted you dead before your daughter could wake up and talk." He hung his head, completely broken by the overwhelming leverage I held over him. I stepped back, finally satisfied. Sarah and Ethan profoundly misunderstood the men they were trying to murder tonight. They looked at our weathered faces, our quiet demeanor, and our inexpensive clothes and assumed we were soft, vulnerable prey. They did not know that Thomas and I were born and raised in the most violent, impoverished slums of Detroit during an era when survival was a daily brutal fight. We did not grow up with trust funds, elite country clubs, or generational safety nets. We grew up dodging stray bullets, navigating vicious neighborhood gang territories, and fighting tooth and nail for every single scrap of food on our dinner table. Our father, a factory worker who survived the harsh Jim Crow South, taught us the world would never be fair to two black boys. He taught us to be resilient, calculated, and completely unyielding when threatened. Thomas channeled that aggressive grit into a decorated 30-year career hunting the most dangerous domestic terrorists for the federal government. I channeled that same relentless survival instinct into mastering the complex flow of illegal money, dismantling untouchable crime syndicates from the inside out. We had spent our entire adult lives swimming comfortably in waters infested with real apex predators. Sarah was merely a greedy, arrogant real estate developer hiding behind a fragile facade of high society privilege. She was entirely accustomed to bullying weak people with expensive lawsuits and intimidation tactics. She had absolutely no idea how to combat two hardened veterans who were intimately familiar with the darkest corners of human nature. By sending a hired gun to our family home, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. We were no longer playing defense. We were going to annihilate her world with the brutal efficiency we learned on the unforgiving streets of our youth. Just as I prepared to drag the disabled hitman into the basement for further interrogation, my encrypted cell phone vibrated intensely in my pocket. The caller ID displayed a restricted local hospital extension. I answered it immediately, pressing the speaker firmly against my ear. "Mr. Jerome," a familiar nurse whispered, her voice trembling with barely concealed anxiety. "I am calling from the intensive care unit. I am not supposed to be doing this, but you need to know right now. Your daughter Jessica is remarkably fighting through the deep sedation. She is actively showing real signs of waking up tonight." A massive surge of hopeful relief washed over my exhausted body, but it was instantly shattered by her very next sentence. "You cannot come here," the nurse continued, speaking rapidly. Sarah just arrived with her aggressive legal team and 2 armed private security guards. They presented a certified court order signed by a corrupt local judge. It is a strict restraining order claiming you are a violent threat to the patient. You are permanently banned from stepping foot anywhere inside this entire medical facility. If you show up in the parking lot, they will have you arrested on site and thrown into federal jail. The line abruptly went dead, leaving me staring at Thomas in silence. I lowered the phone slowly, letting the dial tone hum into the silent room. Thomas watched me, his sharp eyes analyzing my next move. "The hospital is completely locked down," I told him, my voice steady despite the rage bubbling underneath. Sarah brought a corrupted judge into her pocket. "They have a certified restraining order against me. If I take one step onto that medical campus, I will be arrested instantly, and Jessica will be left completely defenseless." Thomas tightened his grip on his weapon. "We can bypass their security, Jerome," he offered. "I know 3 blind spots in that hospital layout." I shook my head firmly. "No, that is exactly what Sarah wants. She wants me to act like a violent thug so she can justify her fake narrative to the authorities. We are not going to play her game. We are going to make her play ours." I looked down at my blood-stained clothes and the fresh wound on my shoulder. I needed to become the exact pathetic caricature she believed me to be. If I cannot get to my daughter, I will go directly to the source of the poison. I am going straight to Sarah's sprawling estate right now. Thomas looked at me like I had lost my mind. "You cannot just walk up to her front door, Jerome. She will have her private security shoot you for trespassing." I grabbed a worn-out, oversized coat from the hallway closet, intentionally making myself look smaller and weaker. "She will not shoot me, Thomas. Her ego is way too massive. She will want to gloat. She needs to feel absolute power over me to satisfy her twisted superiority complex. I am going to give her exactly what she craves. I am going to hand her a golden crown and let her hang herself with it." The sky broke open as I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. Freezing rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking through my thin jacket and chilling me to the bone. I stood before the imposing security cameras and pressed the intercom button repeatedly. I let my shoulders sag and my hands shake, putting on the performance of a broken, desperate father. The heavy gates slowly swung open, revealing the long, winding driveway leading up to the immaculate mansion. I walked slowly, dragging my feet against the wet gravel, playing the part of a defeated old man. By the time I reached the grand entryway, Sarah was already standing on the sprawling covered porch. She was flanked by two massive security guards holding umbrellas, but she stepped forward into the edge of the rain just to look down at me. She wore a pristine white silk robe holding a crystal glass of wine, her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. "Please," I shouted, letting my voice crack with manufactured agony. "Please, Sarah, just let me see my daughter. I beg you." I dropped heavily onto both knees, plunging them directly into the freezing muddy puddles forming on her expensive aggregate driveway. I clasped my hands together in a gesture of total submission. "Do not lock me out of the hospital. I will not cause any trouble. I just want to hold her hand." Sarah looked at me, shivering in the mud, and a wide, malicious smile spread across her face. She took a slow sip of her wine, savoring the absolute power she held over my family. "Look at you," she sneered, her voice cutting through the heavy rain. "You are exactly where you belong, Jerome. Crawling in the dirt like the pathetic inner-city trash you have always been. I should have never allowed my son to bring your kind into my bloodline. Your daughter is a mistake, a disgusting blemish on our perfect family legacy." I bowed my head lower, absorbing every vile word, projecting total helplessness. "She is going to die tonight, Jerome." Sarah laughed, a sound so evil it made the freezing rain feel warm. "She is going to die, and my son is going to pull the plug, and there is absolutely nothing you or your ghetto family can do about it. A cheap black whore like Jessica never belonged in our world. I am simply cleaning up the garbage. You are going to rot in an empty house while we take everything she owns and erase her entire existence. You are nothing. Your daughter is nothing. Now crawl back to whatever miserable slum you came from before I tell my guards to break your neck." She threw her wine glass at my feet, the crystal shattering into 100 sharp pieces against the wet stone. I kept my head down, trembling violently in the cold, but not from fear. She had no idea that my violent trembling was a calculated physical release to keep myself from leaping onto that porch and tearing her throat out with my bare hands. Every single racist insult, every cruel threat against my dying child burned like battery acid in my chest. But I did not react. I did not flinch or curse. Decades of working undercover, gathering financial intelligence on the most ruthless criminals on earth had taught me the absolute mastery of patience. I knew how to swallow my pride and endure temporary humiliation for a permanent victory. As I knelt in the freezing mud, I subtly angled my chest directly toward her arrogant face. Hidden perfectly inside the top button of my soaked jacket was a high-definition micro-recording device. It was a piece of tactical federal hardware Thomas had procured specifically for this exact psychological operation. It was actively capturing every single word of her vicious, unhinged confession and transmitting it directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server. I did not need to physically fight her tonight. I needed her to feel so incredibly untouchable that she would openly confess her crimes and reveal her true monstrous nature. The worse her insults became, the tighter the digital noose wrapped around her neck. She was freely handing me the exact audio evidence required to completely obliterate her high society reputation and send her to a federal penitentiary for the rest of her miserable life. I slowly gathered myself, standing up with a pathetic, deliberate slouch. I kept my eyes fixed on the muddy ground, acting thoroughly defeated. I turned my back to her malicious laughter and began the long, humiliating walk down the dark driveway. My endurance had reached its absolute peak, but I had secured the ultimate weapon. I stepped out of the massive iron gates and immediately slipped into the shadows where Thomas was waiting for me in the unmarked sedan. I stripped off the soaked jacket and plugged the recording device directly into his military tablet to verify the audio transmission. "We got her," I said, wiping the freezing rain from my face. "She confessed to everything on a crystal-clear digital recording. We can take this to the federal authorities right now." Thomas did not look up from his glowing screen. His face was set in a hard, grim line that instantly made my stomach tighten. "We have a massive problem, Jerome," he said, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "While you were playing the victim at her front door, Sarah's legal team was busy executing their backup plan. They just filed an emergency injunction with the probate court." He turned the tablet toward me, displaying a scanned legal document. "It is a last will and testament, completely transferring all of Jessica's personal assets, corporate equity and financial holdings directly to Ethan in the event of her medical incapacitation or death." Thomas zoomed in on the bottom of the document. The signature looked identical to my daughter's handwriting, and it was fully notarized by a major downtown law firm. "They are officially taking everything tonight." I grabbed the military tablet from Thomas and stared at the glowing screen. The rain hammered against the roof of the unmarked sedan, but inside the vehicle the silence was absolute. My eyes locked onto the digital scan of the last will and testament they had just filed. Sarah and Ethan were arrogant enough to believe a fancy legal seal would deter an old man from challenging them. They forgot they were dealing with someone who spent 40 years dissecting fraudulent documents for the federal government. I zoomed in on Jessica's signature at the bottom of the page. At first glance, the looping letters and sharp angles looked entirely authentic. It was a spectacular forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. I magnified the resolution to maximum capacity and pulled a small magnifying loupe from my tactical vest. I hovered the glass over the high-definition screen, analyzing the ink distribution. There it was, the fatal flaw. When a living, breathing human signs a document, the pressure of the pen creates natural variations in ink density. This signature possessed a flawless, uniform pixelation across every single curve. It had absolutely no hesitation marks and no natural indentations. It was a high-resolution optical scan meticulously lifted from an older document and digitally traced onto this fraudulent will. They had used a high-end commercial scanner to superimpose her name and then paid off a corrupt notary from a major downtown law firm to stamp it with an official seal. "This is completely fake," I told Thomas, pointing at the digital artifact on the screen. "They traced her signature using commercial software. They are trying to steal her entire estate using a fabricated digital ghost." Thomas smirked darkly, crossing his two strong arms. "So what is our exact next move tonight, big brother?" I pulled my encrypted cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had not used since my active duty days. "We are going to bleed them completely dry," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the rain washing over the windshield. "Sarah thinks she can use fraudulent paperwork to absorb my daughter's financial portfolio and protect her illegal cartel money laundering network. I am going to use corporate law to bury her alive." The phone rang 3 times before a sharp, gravelly voice answered on the other end. Mitchell speaking, the voice stated with pure business precision. Mitchell was not just an attorney. He was the most ruthless corporate bankruptcy lawyer in the entire tri-state area. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who made his living dismembering corrupt corporations and liquidating their assets for pennies on the dollar. During my time leading federal task forces, I had fed Mitchell dozens of lucrative civil forfeiture cases. He owed me massive favors. "It is Jerome," I said, my voice hard and commanding. "I need your absolute best financial executioners working on a hostile corporate takeover immediately." I heard the sharp sound of a heavy chair leaning back and the distinct clinking of a whiskey glass being set down on a desk. "Jerome," he replied, his tone instantly shifting to high alert. "You have been off the grid for years, my friend. Who are we aggressively hunting tonight?" "We are hunting Sarah and her entire real estate empire," I instructed clearly. "They just filed a forged last will and testament to illegally seize my daughter's assets. I need you to quietly deploy a network of anonymous shell companies. I want you to actively buy up every single piece of toxic debt, delinquent mortgage, and leveraged commercial loan attached to her corporate umbrella. Purchase it all through aggressive secondary markets before the sun comes up tomorrow." Mitchell let out a low whistle of genuine admiration. "That is an incredibly vicious strategy, Jerome. Buying up her debt gives you the leverage to instantly force her empire into involuntary bankruptcy if she misses a single margin call. But acquiring that level of leveraged debt is going to require immense immediate liquid capital. We are talking millions of dollars in untraceable cash to secure those predatory loans by morning. Do you possess that kind of heavy financial ammunition ready to deploy?" "I do," I confirmed, staring straight ahead into the dark street. "I will wire the necessary capital directly into your secure offshore escrow account within the next hour. Start preparing the hostile acquisition paperwork and do not let her legal team catch a single cent of the trap until the steel jaws completely snap shut around her neck." "Consider it done," Mitchell stated coldly. "She will not even know she is bankrupt until we are actively changing the locks on her corporate headquarters." I ended the call and placed the phone down on the center console. Thomas stared at me with wide eyes, entirely astonished by the sheer magnitude of the financial trap I had just activated in front of him. "You have been retired for 10 years, Jerome," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Where on earth did you get millions of dollars in untraceable liquid cash to finance a hostile corporate takeover?" I leaned back against the leather seat of the sedan, watching the heavy rain slide down the cold glass. I turned to my brother and finally revealed the ultimate financial safeguard I had spent the last decade meticulously building in absolute secrecy. When Jessica was born, Evelyn and I made a solemn promise that our daughter would never experience the brutal poverty we endured, I explained quietly. During my career recovering billions in stolen cartel assets, I occasionally received massive federal whistleblower bounties and percentage-based asset recovery rewards. Instead of upgrading our lifestyle, I quietly funneled every single penny into a highly secured blind trust. I grew that account through aggressive compound interest and international municipal bonds until it reached exactly $8 million. The money legally belongs to Jessica, but the structural architecture of the trust dictates that I am the sole executing trustee with absolute veto power over any financial transfers. Sarah and Ethan assumed Jessica only possessed the minor company shares they graciously allowed her to hold. Their arrogant corporate accountants failed to dig deep enough into her restricted background. They have absolutely no idea she is sitting on a massive fortress of untouchable wealth. That $8 million ghost fund is the exact ammunition Mitchell is currently using to aggressively devour Sarah's corrupt real estate empire tonight. I handed the tablet back to Thomas. They thought they cornered a completely defenseless and extremely poor old man tonight. Just as Thomas nodded in silent agreement, my encrypted cell phone vibrated violently against the console. The caller ID displayed an unknown restricted number. I answered, and Sarah's shrill voice immediately pierced my ear. "You think you are so remarkably clever, Jerome?" she hissed, her tone vibrating with pure venomous panic. "My accountants just detected a massive external trust fund attached to your daughter's social security number interfering with our asset transfer. You are going to sign executive control of that $8 million account over to me right now." I remained perfectly silent, letting her desperation bleed through the speaker. "If you refuse to sign the transfer papers within the next hour," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "I am going to make a simple phone call to the hospital. My private medical staff is standing by her bedside right now. One quick injection of a fatal drug overdose and Jessica will die of a tragic sudden cardiac arrest before noon. They will simply rule it an unfortunate medical complication." The bright red digital clock on the dashboard glared back at me, showing we had very little time left to act. She had completely bypassed the legal system and escalated directly to an imminent lethal threat against my vulnerable daughter tonight. The dial tone echoed in the silent car, ringing like a death knell. Sarah had bypassed the legal maneuvering and escalated to a direct, imminent execution. I looked at the digital clock glowing red on the dashboard. It was precisely 2:14 in the morning. We did not have an hour to negotiate, and I absolutely refused to surrender my daughter trust fund to a cartel money launderer. Thomas stared at me, awaiting my command. The local police had the front entrance heavily barricaded, and a corrupt judge had legally banned me from stepping onto the hospital grounds. Sarah had private security guards stationed directly outside Jessica's intensive care room, ready to inject a lethal overdose the moment she gave the order. "We are out of legal options," I stated, my voice cold and entirely devoid of panic. "If we leave her in that hospital bed for another 10 minutes, she will be murdered and they will call it a tragic medical complication. We are going to extract her right now." Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt, his face hardening into the familiar mask of a seasoned tactical operator. "A full extraction from a locked-down medical facility is a highly complex maneuver, Jerome," he warned, pulling a heavy matte black flashlight and a pair of tactical restraints from his glove compartment. "They have cameras covering every single corridor and armed men on the 3rd floor. We will be walking directly into a heavily fortified death trap." I grabbed my heavy wrench, gripping the cold metal tightly. "I do not care if they have an entire battalion waiting in the lobby," I replied, opening the sedan door. "We are bringing my daughter home tonight. No fortress is strong enough to keep me away from my child when her survival matters most today." We bypassed the front lobby completely, moving swiftly through the dense bushes toward the external generator housing on the west side. Thomas pulled a heavy multi-tool from his belt and effortlessly popped the rusted padlock off the main utility panel. "You will have exactly 3 minutes of total darkness before the emergency backup generators engage and the security feeds reboot," he whispered, handing me a small pair of night vision goggles. "The moment the lights cut out, you move." I slipped the goggles over my eyes and nodded, gripping my wrench. Thomas yanked the primary breaker switch downward with a violent snap. The massive hospital plunged into absolute pitch blackness instantly. I sprinted through the staff loading dock, navigating the dark corridors with the silent precision of a ghost. The emergency exit stairs were completely unmonitored. I took them two at a time, ignoring the burning ache in my 69-year-old knees. I reached the third-floor intensive care unit in exactly 70 seconds. Through the green tint of my goggles, I spotted the private security guard standing directly outside my daughter room. He was frantically tapping his radio, confused by the sudden blackout. I stepped out of the stairwell, closing the distance in 3 long strides. I swung the heavy wrench in a calculated arc, striking him squarely on his tactical helmet. He collapsed to the floor, instantly unconscious, without making a single sound. I pushed the door open and rushed to the hospital bed. Jessica was pale, her chest rising and falling unevenly beneath the sterile blanket. I quickly disconnected the intravenous lines and the heart monitor wires, silencing the alarms. I wrapped her fragile body securely and lifted her into my arms. Her eyelids fluttered open, struggling against the heavy sedatives flowing through her veins. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely a dry, raspy breath against my shoulder. "I am here, baby," I promised, moving rapidly toward the doorway. "We are leaving right now." She weakly gripped my flannel shirt, her eyes wide with a sudden desperate urgency. The USB drive, she choked out, struggling to form the words. "I hid the cartel ledger. It is in my old bedroom. The music box. The one Mom gave me." My heart slammed fiercely against my ribs. "Do not speak," I commanded softly, adjusting my grip on her. "Save your strength." I carried her out of the room and back down the dark stairwell. The emergency sirens began to wail loudly just as I reached the loading dock doors. The 3 minutes were officially up, and the backup generators roared to life, flooding the corridors with blinding white light. Thomas was already waiting with the sedan engine running, the rear door wide open. I laid her gently onto the back seat, jumping into the passenger side as Thomas slammed the gas pedal down. We tore out of the alleyway, disappearing into the dark streets just as the police scrambled to secure the hospital behind us. We succeeded. The seamless execution of our dangerous hospital infiltration was not a sudden stroke of luck or a random coincidence. It was the direct result of decades of intense, high-stakes professional experience and an unspoken, lifelong bond forged in the fires of mutual survival. Thomas and I had spent our entire adult lives operating on the opposite ends of the exact same brutal federal spectrum. He was the kinetic physical force, a highly decorated domestic anti-terrorism agent who spent his career aggressively kicking down fortified doors, conducting midnight raids, and extracting high-value targets from impossible tactical situations under heavy enemy fire. I was the silent, invisible ghost, the meticulous forensic accountant who patiently tracked millions of dollars in bloody cartel cash, dismantling entire criminal empires without ever firing a single bullet. Together we formed an absolutely perfect predatory organism. Our individual skills complemented each other flawlessly, creating a devastating combination of physical violence and unmatched intellectual calculation. When we were young boys growing up in the violent, impoverished streets of Detroit, our father taught us that we only had each other to rely on in a world that wanted us to fail. He drilled an unwavering loyalty into our minds, ensuring that if one brother bled, the other would inevitably bring the hammer down upon whoever caused the pain. Tonight, as we drove through the dark, empty streets with my gravely injured daughter safely secured in the back seat, that ancient brotherhood was fully activated. We did not need to speak or loudly debate our next strategic move because our minds were already functioning as one unified weapon aimed directly at Sarah. We were fully prepared to burn her elite world to ash, and we possessed the exact operational skills required to guarantee her total destruction tonight without failure. We arrived at an unlisted underground medical clinic operated by a former military trauma surgeon who owed Thomas his life. The doctor immediately took Jessica into a sterile room to stabilize her vitals and flush the remaining neurotoxin from her system. While she was finally safe, Thomas flipped open his military tablet to continuously monitor the local police frequencies and the encrypted municipal traffic cameras. His weathered face suddenly went completely pale as a rapid series of unauthorized digital intrusions flashed across his bright screen. "Jerome, look at this," Thomas urged, pointing a thick finger at the monitor. Ethan did not just sit back after we took Jessica. He actively hacked the hospital intersection cameras and tracked our exact initial trajectory. Even worse, he figured out what Jessica whispered to you. A live satellite feed displayed my old wooden house, the very home where Evelyn and I had raised our daughter. 3 black, heavily armored tactical vans were aggressively pulling onto my quiet street right now. Over a dozen heavily armed mercenaries, led personally by a furious Ethan, were actively surrounding my property, preparing to tear the house apart to find the hidden music box. They were minutes away from recovering the absolute sole piece of physical evidence capable of destroying their entire laundering operation. I stared at the satellite feed, watching Ethan and his heavily armed mercenaries swarm my property. They were tearing through the front door, searching for the exact piece of evidence that would send his mother and him to federal prison for the rest of their pathetic lives. I turned to the trauma surgeon, ensuring Jessica was stable. Thomas offered to come with me, but I placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Stay here and guard her," I commanded. "If they track my vehicle back here, you need to be ready. This is my house, and I will deal with Ethan personally." I grabbed the keys to the unmarked sedan and sprinted out of the underground clinic into the freezing night air. I pushed the powerful engine to its absolute limit, tearing through the quiet suburban streets. I arrived at my neighborhood parking 2 blocks away to approach on foot. The street was dead quiet except for the low hum of the tactical vans parked illegally on my lawn. I slipped through the backyard, utilizing the shadows of the old oak tree I had planted when Jessica was just a little girl. The back door was already smashed open. I drew a deep breath and stepped quietly into the kitchen. I could hear heavy boots stomping upstairs and furniture being violently thrown across the living room. I walked straight into the hallway, making no effort to hide my footsteps anymore. Ethan was standing in the center of my ruined living room, kicking over the antique coffee table Evelyn had meticulously restored decades ago. He completely froze when he saw me standing right in the doorway. "You just could not stay away." "Could you, old man?" Ethan sneered, drawing a suppressed pistol from his tactical vest and pointing it directly at my chest. Ethan smirked, signaling 2 of his heavily armored mercenaries to flank me. "You are standing in the wreckage of your miserable little life. You really thought you could steal Jessica from the hospital and hide her from us. We own this town. We own the police. We own you. Where is the music box, old man? Tell me right now, or my men will slowly break every bone in your fragile body before we put a bullet in your skull." I did not flinch or beg. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his face, portraying the image of a defeated father who had simply run out of options. I slowly raised my hands and pointed toward the loose floorboard beneath the old brick fireplace. "It is under the hearth," I said, my voice low and steady. "Just take it and leave us alone." Ethan laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that echoed in the destroyed room. "Check it," he ordered his men. As the 2 mercenaries holstered their weapons and knelt by the fireplace, pulling up the heavy wooden planks, I smoothly reached into my oversized coat. I did not pull out a gun. I pulled out the small wooden music box Jessica had whispered about. I had retrieved it from its real hiding place inside the kitchen pantry, moments before stepping into the living room. I held it tightly in my left hand, ensuring the USB drive was securely locked inside its hidden compartment. Ethan realized what was happening a second too late. Before he could raise his weapon, I swiftly reached down and grabbed the heavy iron wrench I had left on the side table. I swung it violently, smashing the primary gas line valve connected to the vintage heating unit on the wall. The pipe ruptured instantly, filling the enclosed room with the overwhelming hiss and toxic smell of concentrated natural gas. "Are you insane?" Ethan screamed, coughing and stumbling backward as the invisible cloud rapidly expanded around us. "Shoot him," he yelled at his men. But discharging a firearm in a room filled with raw gas was a guaranteed death sentence, and his mercenaries knew it. They hesitated, completely paralyzed by the sudden tactical shift. I did not hesitate. I pulled a simple metal Zippo lighter from my pocket, the one Evelyn had gifted me on our 10th anniversary. I flicked the lid open with my thumb. "You said we do not belong in your world, Ethan," I stated coldly, watching the sheer terror finally register in his privileged eyes. "You are absolutely right." I struck the flint. The spark caught instantly. I tossed the burning lighter directly into the massive cloud of escaping gas. The explosion was a catastrophic shockwave of pure kinetic heat. The blast forcefully threw Ethan and his mercenaries backward against the reinforced walls, shattering every single window on the ground floor. A massive wall of roaring flames instantly consumed the living room, trapping the armed men in a deadly inferno. The searing heat washed over my face as the raging fire rapidly devoured the heavy curtains and the ancient hardwood floors. I stood silent for a fraction of a second, watching the flames completely consume the home Evelyn and I had spent 40 years building together. Every single physical memory we had created in this house was actively turning to ash. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where we measured Jessica growing up year by year. The worn-out armchair where I used to read complex financial briefs late into the night. The beautiful vintage photographs hanging on the hallway walls documenting decades of quiet, modest happiness. All of it was violently burning away right before my eyes. I felt a profound sense of loss, but absolutely zero regret tonight. Holding tightly onto the past was a luxury I could no longer afford if I wanted to guarantee my daughter future survival. The fire was not a tragedy to me. It was a mandatory, brutal purification. By intentionally burning down my own sanctuary, I was officially severing all ties to the quiet, passive life I had maintained for so long. I was fully accepting my role as the relentless executioner. Sarah and Ethan thought they could use my sentimental attachments as leverage against me. They believed destroying my physical home would shatter my spirit and force me into submission. They failed to understand that the moment the flames consumed my history, I became an untethered ghost with absolutely nothing left to lose. I turned my back on the blazing living room, leaving Ethan and his trapped mercenaries to their fiery demise. I had the music box and the digital evidence required to annihilate their entire criminal syndicate. I immediately sprinted toward the shattered back door as the structural integrity of the ceiling began to fail. A massive blazing wooden beam collapsed directly into my path, blocking the only exit. I raised my left arm to shield my face and violently shoved the burning debris aside. The scorching wood seared deeply through my jacket, brutally burning the flesh on my left forearm and hand. I ignored the excruciating pain and launched myself out into the freezing backyard just as the entire first floor erupted into a massive fireball. I disappeared into the thick tree line, completely unseen by the arriving emergency vehicles. By dawn, the local news stations were actively broadcasting live footage of the smoldering ruins of my property. The corrupt police chief released an official statement confirming that a tragic accidental gas explosion had completely leveled the residence, claiming the life of the elderly homeowner inside. They confidently and blindly believed my charred remains were buried under the toxic ash. Later that evening, Sarah and her elite associates hosted a lavish private celebration at their massive, sprawling estate, raising expensive champagne glasses to toast their flawless victory. They were aggressively finalizing their massive corporate merger, totally convinced that the old black man was dead and their bloody secrets were buried forever beneath the ash. I sat in the sterile white illumination of the underground medical bunker, my heavily bandaged left arm throbbing with a dull, relentless ache. The trauma surgeon had meticulously cleaned and dressed the severe burns I sustained during the explosive destruction of my home, but I completely ignored the physical pain. My entire focus was rigidly locked onto the glowing screen of Thomas' heavily encrypted military laptop. I carefully inserted the small metallic flash drive I had successfully extracted from the hidden compartment of Jessica's vintage wooden music box. A password prompt instantly appeared, demanding a complex alphanumeric sequence. I knew my brilliant daughter perfectly well. I typed in the exact geographic coordinates of the tiny, obscure lake where I taught her how to fish when she was just 7 years old. The screen flashed green, granting me absolute administrative access. A massive labyrinth of highly classified financial documents, offshore banking ledgers, and detailed wire transfer manifests instantly populated the bright monitor. I began rapidly opening the heavily secured files, absorbing the sheer, staggering magnitude of their criminal enterprise. Sarah and Ethan had meticulously constructed a brilliant but fatally arrogant financial architecture. They were aggressively washing tens of millions of dollars in illicit narcotics cash through a massive network of fraudulent luxury real estate developments and phantom construction companies. The digital ledger painstakingly documented every single dirty transaction, mapping out the exact illicit pathways connecting their pristine corporate holding firms directly to the most violent, ruthless drug cartels operating across the southern border. Jessica had successfully downloaded the absolute ultimate smoking gun. This tiny piece of plastic contained enough devastating federal evidence to permanently dismantle their entire corrupt empire and secure consecutive life sentences for every single member of their treacherous family bloodline starting tonight without displaying a single shred of mercy. I did not immediately forward the decrypted contents of the flash drive to the local authorities or the regional federal bureau. Sarah had spent decades diligently cultivating deep political connections and aggressively bribing high-ranking law enforcement officials across the entire state. Submitting this highly sensitive intelligence to a corrupted precinct would only guarantee that the catastrophic evidence would be quietly buried, and my daughter would remain a permanent target. If I wanted to guarantee their absolute destruction, I had to personally orchestrate a financial execution so utterly devastating that no amount of dirty money could ever buy their salvation. I picked up my secured mobile phone and immediately dialed Mitchell. The ruthless corporate bankruptcy attorney answered on the first ring, anticipating my precise instructions. "I have the cartel ledgers," I stated coldly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Her entire luxury real estate empire is built directly on top of massive fabricated property valuations and highly toxic leveraged commercial debt. I need you to initiate the hostile acquisition protocol immediately." I navigated toward the secure portal of the untouchable $8 million blind trust I had established for Jessica years ago. Utilizing my overriding executive authority as the sole executing trustee, I aggressively bypassed the standard verification waiting periods and authorized a massive untraceable wire transfer. $8 million in pure verified liquid capital surged directly into Mitchell's private offshore escrow account in less than 30 seconds. "Use every single penny of that capital," I commanded, my tone absolutely uncompromising. "I want you to deploy a complex web of strictly anonymous shell companies and instantly purchase all of her outstanding corporate debt. Buy up every delinquent mortgage, every over-leveraged commercial loan, and every single precarious line of credit her holding firms possess." Mitchell chuckled, a dark predatory sound that echoed through the secure connection. "Buying her debt on the secondary market gives you the supreme legal authority to aggressively call in those massive loans whenever you want, Jerome," he confirmed gleefully. "You are effectively making yourself the supreme financial overlord of her entire organization without her having any prior knowledge. When do you want me to aggressively trigger the mandatory repayment clauses and force her into an involuntary corporate bankruptcy?" I stared at the horrifying financial data cascading rapidly across the bright laptop screen. My severely burned hand throbbed painfully, but my mind remained entirely focused on the impending slaughter. "Do not trigger the final bankruptcy declaration just yet," I instructed quietly. "First, I want you to strategically constrict her oxygen supply, lock down her internal operational liquidity, and completely freeze her access to any external banking capital. Let her slowly suffocate and brutally panic as the walls aggressively close in around her arrogant face. I want her completely ruined and absolutely legally defenseless before I deliver the fatal blow." "The transfer is confirmed," Mitchell replied. "We own her now." I terminated the secure connection, completely sealing her inevitable doom. The financial guillotine was officially suspended directly above her neck. For 40 uninterrupted years, I dedicated my entire professional existence to understanding the complex, microscopic anatomy of global financial corruption. While other federal agents aggressively kicked down wooden doors and engaged in violent tactical shootouts in dangerous urban alleyways, I sat quietly in heavily guarded subterranean server rooms, transforming ordinary spreadsheets into devastating instruments of total warfare. I possessed a highly specialized brain naturally wired to recognize invisible numerical discrepancies and track the microscopic digital footprints left behind by arrogant billionaires attempting to hide their illicit blood money. Sarah and Ethan stupidly believed that true power was derived entirely from political connections, expensive tailored suits, and inherited high society privilege. They looked at my modest clothing, my calloused working-class hands, and my quiet demeanor and tragically assumed I was a completely defenseless elderly man, completely incapable of mounting any significant offensive maneuver against their sprawling empire. They failed to comprehend that the most terrifying predator in the modern criminal underworld is not a man holding a loaded firearm. The most terrifying predator is a veteran forensic accountant who truly understands how to manipulate the vast, intricate web of corporate law and aggressively weaponize the very financial institutions they desperately rely upon for survival. I did not need to physically touch Sarah to completely obliterate her entire pathetic existence. By expertly acquiring her massive mountain of toxic commercial debt through Mitchell anonymous shell companies, I had successfully bypassed her expensive defense attorneys and completely infiltrated the central nervous system of her cartel laundering operation. Every single dollar she arrogantly spent, every luxury property she falsely claimed to own, and every single breath her organization took now belonged entirely to me. The quiet, meticulous old man she mocked was now playing the role of an absolute, undisputed god in her world. Across the city, inside her sprawling, heavily guarded luxury estate, Sarah was rudely awakened by the frantic, continuous buzzing of her private corporate smartphone. She groggily answered, expecting to hear a joyous confirmation that my charred remains had been successfully recovered from the smoldering wreckage of my completely destroyed house. Instead, her panicked chief financial officer delivered a catastrophic message that instantly sent a terrifying chill down her spine. Every single operational bank account tied to their primary holding corporation had been abruptly and aggressively frozen without any prior warning. Major international investment banks were actively denying all their scheduled outgoing wire transfers and aggressively halting their massive incoming cartel deposits. Sarah screamed furiously into the receiver, demanding immediate answers from her highly paid executives, while violently throwing a heavy crystal vase against her bedroom wall. She was absolutely convinced this was a temporary clerical error or a minor regulatory glitch that her expensive lawyers could instantly resolve by morning. She had absolutely no idea that an invisible tightening noose made entirely of weaponized corporate paper was already securely fastened around her arrogant throat, violently choking the life out of her empire. The total annihilation she had actively engineered for my vulnerable daughter was now aggressively coming directly for her own incredibly treacherous head tonight. The financial guillotine did not just hover above Sarah's empire, it dropped with the absolute crushing weight of the federal government. While Mitchell was aggressively acquiring her highly leveraged commercial debt on the secondary markets, I initiated the second phase of my meticulously coordinated attack. Using a deeply secured satellite uplink, I packaged a highly redacted but undeniably lethal dossier containing the most damning evidence from the cartel ledger Jessica had secured. I completely stripped the files of any metadata that could trace the submission back to my daughter or my underground location. I specifically targeted the digital drop boxes for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The algorithms analyzing those specific federal servers are explicitly programmed to flag massive automated anomalies in real estate cash flows, linking them directly to known narcotic syndicates. I did not need to wait for a sluggish human agent to review the complex paperwork or push a file across a bureaucratic desk. By formatting the massive digital submission to perfectly match their internal automated threat matrix, I triggered an immediate algorithmic response. At precisely 6 in the morning, an automated and entirely unappealable federal freeze was simultaneously issued to every single domestic and international financial institution associated with her primary corporate tax identification numbers. The massive corporate accounts holding the cartel's illicit cash were instantly transformed into inaccessible vaults. Every single active corporate line of credit was permanently severed. The swift bureaucratic maneuver completely paralyzed her organization's operational liquidity, locking millions of dollars behind heavily fortified government firewalls. Sarah had built her entire untouchable empire on the illusion of financial invincibility, but I had just aggressively disconnected her entire life support system with a few silent encrypted keystrokes in the cold, unforgiving dark while she foolishly slept. Inside the palatial dining room of her sprawling estate, Sarah sat at a long mahogany table expecting a serene and victorious morning. She was aggressively sipping a cup of expensive imported espresso and admiring the manicured landscaping through her towering floor-to-ceiling windows. She was absolutely convinced that her greatest threat had perished in the explosive house fire last night. The grand upcoming corporate merger was supposed to finalize her transition into legitimate, untouchable wealth. But her delicate porcelain cup violently shattered against the polished hardwood floor when her smartphone began vibrating relentlessly. It was not a single phone call. It was a torrential avalanche of sheer, uninterrupted panic. Her chief operating officer called first, his voice cracking with absolute sheer terror as he frantically explained that the primary payroll accounts were completely locked. Before Sarah could even process his frantic screaming, her senior vice president of acquisitions called on the secondary line to deliver an even more catastrophic update. Every single construction escrow account tied to their pending luxury developments had been inexplicably frozen by the regional banks. Sarah leapt up from her expensive leather chair, her face flushing a dark shade of crimson. She aggressively screamed, demanding they immediately override the protocols. "Fix this right now, you incompetent fools," she roared, pacing like a completely cornered animal. Call the regional banking directors and threaten them with a massive class action lawsuit. But the terrified executives informed her that the regional banking directors were entirely powerless. The freeze was not a local administrative glitch. It was a highly classified federal mandate originating directly from the highest enforcement levels in Washington. Sarah snatched her burner phone, attempting to log into offshore Cayman accounts to verify her safety nets. The screen repeatedly flashed bright red, indicating a total access denial. The international banks, terrified of federal sanctions, had instantly severed all their lucrative connections with her tainted holding companies. She completely lost her sophisticated aristocratic composure. She violently swept her forearm across the dining table, sending expensive crystal vases, silver utensils, and her catered breakfast crashing chaotically onto the expensive Persian rug. Ethan rushed in wearing his silk bathrobe, his eyes wide with groggy confusion. "What the hell is going on, Mother?" he demanded, staring at the immense destruction scattered across the room. "We are completely locked out of the money," Sarah screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Every single bank account is actively frozen. We cannot move a single dime of cartel cash, and the merger investors will pull out by noon." Ethan's face turned completely ghostly pale. "If we cannot transfer the cartel distributions by Friday, they will brutally murder us," he stammered, his knees visibly buckling under the sudden weight of their impending demise. Sarah wildly dialed her attorney, gripping the phone incredibly tightly, her knuckles turning white. Her pristine, untouchable world was aggressively collapsing around her arrogant head at lightning speed, and she had absolutely no idea who was systematically pulling the strings. While the most powerful white family in the county completely descended into primal, uncontrollable panic, I sat perfectly still inside the heavily fortified subterranean medical bunker. My heavily bandaged left arm rested gently on the metal table as I calmly lifted a styrofoam cup of completely cold black coffee to my lips. My eyes remained absolutely glued to the high-definition monitor displaying the live, real-time global stock market indexes. I was watching the publicly traded shell companies associated with her expansive corporate portfolio begin an aggressive, unrecoverable downward spiral. A faint, icy smile touched my weathered face. When I first started working as a federal forensic accountant 4 decades ago, they handed me mountains of physical paper boxes overflowing with forged receipts, handwritten ledgers, and manipulated tax returns. I spent thousands of agonizing hours sitting under flickering fluorescent lights, manually tracing every single dirty dollar back to the violent men who mistakenly thought they could outsmart the government. Over the years, I evolved alongside the criminal networks, mastering encrypted data streams, automated market algorithms, and offshore financial architecture. I learned the most fundamental truth about elite criminals who hide behind expensive suits and inherited generational power. They are entirely dependent on the illusion of limitless liquid capital to maintain their terrifying authority. If you physically attack them, they simply hire armed mercenaries to destroy you. But if you aggressively sever their financial arteries and publicly expose their fraudulent leverage, they instantly cannibalize each other like starving feral dogs. Sarah built her empire entirely on the blood of innocent people and the unearned arrogance of her prejudiced lineage. Sitting in the sterile bunker, I simply watched the digital numbers brutally evaporate into absolute nothingness, successfully executing the exact financial justice she arrogantly believed she was completely immune to today. While Sarah was desperately shouting into her dead burner phone, attempting to reach her compromised attorneys, a private courier van silently pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of her estate. An anonymous driver dropped a small plain cardboard box directly at the security checkpoint and instantly vanished into the morning traffic. The head security guard hastily carried the unmarked package into the ruined dining room, placing it directly onto the only cleared section of the mahogany table. Sarah viciously ripped open the tightly sealed cardboard flap, her manicured fingers trembling violently with sheer, unadulterated terror. Nestled deeply inside the box, resting on a piece of dark velvet, was the heavy, solid gold Rolex watch Ethan had explicitly worn to my house last night. The highly expensive timepiece was entirely shattered and heavily stained with thick, coagulated crimson blood. A small typed menacing note was securely pinned beneath the broken watch. Sarah felt her absolute, desperate breath aggressively catch in her throat as she slowly read the stark, terrifying message. "You proudly said, 'We do not belong in your perfect world,'" the note read, displaying absolute, lethal certainty. "You are completely right, Sarah. Now the heavily armed cartel is actively coming tonight to permanently ensure you do not belong anywhere in this world anymore." Sarah dropped the bloody Rolex onto the floor as if the gold itself were burning her skin. She stumbled backward violently, knocking over a heavy mahogany chair. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her suddenly looking exactly like a terrified ghost now. Her mind, which was usually a fortress of arrogant calculations, instantly shattered into a million fragments of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at the blood smeared across the velvet box and immediately jumped to the exact conclusion I had meticulously engineered for her. She did not suspect an old accountant or a retired federal agent. She was absolutely certain that the ruthless Southern cartel had just discovered the massive financial freeze and was actively sending heavily armed hit squads to brutally execute her family today. The cartel did not tolerate frozen assets or locked accounts. They demanded immediate operational liquidity and strictly punished failures with extreme, terrifying violence. Sarah frantically scrambled across the ruined dining room floor, eagerly grabbing her burner phone with violently shaking hands. She dialed the front gate security pavilion, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "Lock down the entire perimeter right now," she screamed. "Shut the heavy iron gates and arm every single guard on the property with lethal weapons. Shoot absolutely anyone who approaches the estate borders." She scrambled toward the heavy, reinforced, solid steel doors of her private panic room located deep within the center of the mansion. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, mimicking a severe panic attack. She was no longer the untouchable queen of a pristine real estate empire. She was a hunted animal desperately trying to hide from apex predators she mistakenly believed were currently breaching her property walls. The illusion of her safety was completely destroyed, leaving her trembling alone in the cold dark. While Sarah cowered in her panic room, Thomas was actively intercepting her digital communications using a highly classified cell site simulator he had quietly erected outside the perimeter. The sophisticated federal hardware seamlessly routed every single outgoing and incoming mobile call directly through his encrypted tactical laptop. I sat beside him inside the medical bunker, monitoring the audio feed as the inevitable internal collapse rapidly unfolded. A call violently connected. It was Ethan. He was frantically hiding inside a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city, absolutely terrified because his own private mercenaries had seemingly vanished into thin air after the explosive fire at my house. He did not know they were dead. He only knew he was completely exposed. "Mother," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "The cartel is definitely coming for us. I went to the secondary bank to withdraw emergency cash, but the teller explicitly said my personal accounts were entirely frozen under federal order." "What did you do?" Sarah shrieked back at him, her own terror amplifying his fragile mental state. "Do not blame me, you worthless coward," she spat viciously. "This is entirely your fault. If you had handled your miserable wife properly when she first found the cartel ledger, none of this would be happening right now. You are weak, Ethan. You have always been weak." Ethan let out a loud, agonizing wail directly into the receiver, sounding like a deeply wounded child rather than a wealthy corporate executive. "I did exactly what you explicitly ordered me to do, Mother," he screamed, his voice dripping with absolute, undeniable guilt. "You were the one who bought the neurotoxin. You forced me to inject Jessica and drag her bleeding body into those freezing woods. You ordered me to murder my own wife to protect your disgusting money laundering operation. I am going to prison forever because of you. I am a dead man." The sheer magnitude of his complete emotional breakdown was flawlessly captured and immediately digitized by Thomas equipment. Every single tearful confession, every frantic accusation, and every vicious insult they hurled at each other was actively recorded in stunningly pristine, high-definition audio. They were aggressively tearing each other apart without a single drop of external physical violence required. "You listen to me, you pathetic, sniveling failure," Sarah roared, her maternal facade completely eroding into pure, unadulterated venom. "You will keep your mouth tightly shut and follow my exact instructions, or I will personally hand you over to the cartel operatives myself. I am not going down for your sloppy mistakes. You are my son, but I will absolutely sacrifice you if it means saving my own life. Do you understand me?" Ethan began weeping uncontrollably, uttering incoherent apologies and begging his ruthless mother for salvation while she coldly berated him for his sheer incompetence. Thomas reached over and firmly pressed the save command, securely backing up the unedited audio file directly into heavily fortified offshore servers. I stared intently at the glowing monitor. Listening to their desperate cannibalistic breakdown from the safety of the sterile medical bunker, I felt a profound sense of absolute vindication. For decades, I had meticulously observed this exact same psychological phenomenon occurring repeatedly among the so-called elite echelons of society. People like Sarah and Ethan possessed an artificial invincibility, manufactured entirely by generational wealth, expensive lawyers, and corrupted political connections. They fundamentally believed their pristine white skin and designer clothing elevated them above the basic moral laws governing ordinary citizens. They were incredibly brave when they were actively destroying the quiet lives of working-class people or plotting the murder of a brilliant young black woman they arrogantly deemed unworthy of their family name. But the exact moment that protective barrier of unlimited money was abruptly stripped away, exposing them to the raw, brutal consequences of their own heinous actions, their manufactured courage instantly evaporated into thin air. They possessed absolutely no genuine loyalty, no foundational honor, and strictly zero authentic familial love. When faced with the terrifying prospect of lengthy federal prison sentences or imminent cartel violence, they did not stand united against the threat. They immediately turned into starving feral dogs, aggressively biting and violently tearing at each other's throats to secure their own personal survival. They were absolutely not apex predators. They were simply well-dressed cowards, constantly relying on a deeply flawed system to shield them from accountability. My father always told me that true strength is revealed when a man has absolutely nothing left to lose. My brave daughter and I naturally possessed that profound, authentic strength, continually forged through many generations of legitimate, unyielding struggle. Sarah and Ethan only possessed an illusion, and I had just shattered it into a million unrecoverable pieces simply by removing their financial oxygen supply today. Through the intercepted audio feed, I heard Sarah abruptly stop her hysterical screaming and inhale a sharp, ragged breath. The sheer terror of the cartel threat miraculously forced her to violently compartmentalize her overwhelming panic and formulate a wildly desperate escape plan. "Listen to me very closely, you pathetic idiot," she hissed, her voice completely devoid of any remaining maternal affection. "We have exactly one singular way out of this impending bloodbath today. The massive corporate merger is officially scheduled to be signed publicly at the Grand Gala tonight. If we successfully execute that contract, the naive foreign investors will instantly inject $30 million of untraceable clean liquid capital directly into our offshore holding accounts. We are going to attend that gala tonight, smile for the flashing cameras, and forcefully secure that signature. The very second that money physically clears, we are abandoning this entire empire and fleeing the country permanently on a private jet before the cartel assassins can ever find us. Get dressed and meet me at the hotel immediately," she ordered, violently slamming the phone down. I slowly removed my headphones, staring at the digital recording. Sarah was eagerly betting her entire miserable life on tonight, but she had absolutely no idea the final executioner was already firmly holding the pen. The grand ballroom of the five-star luxury hotel was a dazzling display of manufactured opulence and blinding crystal chandeliers. Sarah stood near the head of the massive banquet table, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility, despite the paralyzing terror actively consuming her internal organs. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown that perfectly masked the frantic tremor in her knees. Beside her stood Ethan, looking completely hollowed out in his tailored tuxedo, his eyes constantly darting toward the exits like a terrified hostage. Surrounding them were the naive foreign investors, wealthy men completely oblivious to the horrific crimes funding the expansive real estate empire they were about to acquire. Sarah commanded the room attention, tapping a silver spoon gracefully against her tall champagne flute. The gentle chime instantly silenced the gentle murmurs of the elite crowd. "Tonight we are not merely celebrating a highly lucrative corporate merger," Sarah announced, her voice projecting flawless aristocratic confidence across the crowded ballroom. "We are cementing a generational legacy of absolute excellence and unwavering resilience." She paused, carefully adopting an expression of profound manufactured grief. "We are also dedicating this monumental achievement to the tragic and sudden loss of my beloved daughter-in-law, Jessica. Her unexpected passing has left a massive void in our hearts, but we must bravely march forward in her profound honor." She raised her sparkling glass high above her head, flashing a brilliant predatory smile at the lead investor. To the future and to an incredibly prosperous partnership, she declared smoothly. The elite guests immediately raised their glasses in unison, completely captivated by her masterful performance. She was mere moments away from securing the $30 million signature that would guarantee her permanent escape from the impending cartel violence tonight before the dangerous criminals could locate her. Before the foreign investors could bring the expensive champagne to their lips, a thunderous mechanical crash violently shattered the sophisticated ambiance of the luxurious ballroom. The massive double oak doors at the main entrance were aggressively kicked open with such devastating force that the heavy brass handles slammed violently against the expensive plaster walls, creating a deafening shockwave that instantly paralyzed the entire room. Every single wealthy guest froze in absolute terror, turning their heads simultaneously toward the grand entryway. Standing squarely in the doorway, completely silhouetted against the bright hallway lights, was me. I did not wear an expensive tailored tuxedo or a modern designer suit. I was dressed in a deeply faded charcoal gray wool suit that my late father had proudly worn during the brutal Jim Crow era, a powerful physical garment carrying decades of unyielding resilience and legitimate working-class dignity. My heavily bandaged left arm securely rested in a dark medical sling, a permanent physical reminder of the blazing inferno I had willingly walked through to secure my daughter's salvation. I stepped slowly into the grand ballroom, my heavy leather work boots making a slow, rhythmic thud against the pristine marble flooring. The dense crowd of wealthy elites instinctively parted like the Red Sea, aggressively backing away from the overwhelming aura of pure lethal determination radiating from my entire physical presence. I marched directly toward the head table, keeping my cold, furious eyes absolutely locked onto Sarah's pale face. The brilliant, triumphant smile she had manufactured just seconds ago instantly vanished, replaced by a twisted mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She literally stopped breathing. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from her trembling, manicured fingers, plummeting toward the floor and shattering violently into 1,000 sharp pieces upon impact. The sound of breaking glass echoed sharply across the dead, silent ballroom, but I never broke my steady, relentless stride. Ethan saw me approaching and physically stumbled backward, backing aggressively into the banquet table, sending a heavy silver serving platter crashing to the ground. He looked exactly as though he had just witnessed a charred corpse rising directly from a burning grave to drag his miserable soul straight down into hell. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the head table, standing tall and projecting immense authority over the very same people who had arrogantly dismissed me as a pathetic, uneducated outsider. The entire room held its collective breath, completely captivated and deeply terrified by the sudden violent disruption. I did not shout or aggressively raise my voice. I did not need to scream to establish absolute dominance in this room today. My mere existence was a catastrophic structural failure of their entire master plan. The ghost they thought they had safely buried under the toxic ash of my ruined home was now standing directly in front of them, completely prepared to aggressively collect an enormous bloody debt. I stared directly into Sarah's terrified soul, letting her comprehend the sheer magnitude of her impending destruction before opening my mouth to deliver the fatal blow to her fake empire tonight without hesitation. For decades, these privileged individuals had existed entirely within a meticulously fabricated bubble of extreme wealth and unearned superiority. They falsely believed that their tailored designer clothing, their massive offshore bank accounts, and their exclusive gala invitations somehow elevated them far above the fundamental moral consequences of their own heinous actions. They had constructed an artificial reality where people who looked exactly like me were strictly relegated to the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, viewed merely as disposable tools or unfortunate collateral damage in their relentless pursuit of unmitigated power. Sarah had aggressively weaponized that exact racist mentality when she cruelly mocked my daughter and violently ordered her brutal execution in the freezing woods. But standing squarely in the center of their pristine, glamorous sanctuary, I represented the ultimate inescapable reckoning. The profound visual contrast between the glittering crystal chandeliers illuminating the room and the dark soot-stained fabric of my vintage suit created a terrifying psychological dissonance for everyone present. I was no longer just a grieving father mourning the vicious assault on his only child. I was the physical embodiment of absolute undeniable justice actively infiltrating their sacred fortress. My working-class hands, which had spent a lifetime diligently performing complex forensic audits and aggressively tracing their hidden bloody money, were now completely ready to systematically dismantle their entire pathetic empire piece by piece. The overwhelming silence enveloping the vast ballroom was not merely born of shock, but of a deep, primal understanding that their manufactured invincibility had been permanently breached today. They looked at my calm, weathered face and instantly recognized that I possessed the precise intellectual weaponry required to completely eradicate their financial existence without displaying a single ounce of mercy tonight before anyone in this massively corrupt room could even attempt to safely breathe. Sarah finally managed to break free from her terrifying paralysis. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage as she frantically pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice completely cracking under the immense pressure of her impending doom. "Arrest that psychotic old man immediately and throw him out of my hotel." Four massive, heavily muscled private security guards instantly lunged forward from the dark perimeter of the ballroom, reaching aggressively for their holstered weapons and tactical batons to execute her desperate command. I did not flinch or take a single defensive step backward. Before the lead guard could lay a single violent hand on my vintage suit, a sharp, commanding voice echoed powerfully from the shattered entryway behind me. "I strongly suggest you do not touch him, gentlemen." Mitchell, the ruthless corporate bankruptcy attorney, stepped confidently into the bright light, holding a thick stack of certified legal documents. He casually tossed the heavy paperwork directly onto the nearest crystal dining table. "The private security firm employing you was heavily leveraged and completely acquired. 30 minutes ago," Mitchell announced, flashing a cold, predatory smile at the confused armed men. "You take your new highly classified operational orders directly from him right now without any further questions." The four heavily muscled private security guards instantly halted their aggressive advance toward me. They looked from Sarah to Mitchell and then down at the certified legal documents scattered across the crystal dining table. Recognizing the undeniable seal of corporate ownership, they immediately holstered their tactical batons and stepped back into the shadows, refusing to follow Sarah's desperate commands. The grand ballroom instantly erupted into a deafening chorus of chaotic murmurs and panicked gasps. The wealthy foreign investors began whispering frantically to their legal aides, realizing this highly lucrative corporate merger was rapidly deteriorating into a spectacular public disaster. Sarah stood frozen behind the head table, her chest heaving as she watched her expensive perimeter defense completely evaporate before her eyes. Ethan was trembling violently, practically hiding behind a massive floral arrangement. Seeing her absolute authority crumbling, Sarah shot a desperate, pleading look toward the center of the elite crowd. Stepping forward from a group of local politicians was the powerfully built, corrupt police chief dressed in a tailored evening suit. He had been quietly enjoying the lavish gala, expecting to collect his massive bribery payment once the merger finalized. Realizing his own illegal financial pipeline was in severe jeopardy, the chief decided to aggressively intervene. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, marching directly toward me with pure malice in his eyes. "You are trespassing on private property." Jerome the chief barked, his voice booming over the panicked crowd, attempting to project official authority. "You are a severely deranged old man causing a dangerous public disturbance. I am placing you under immediate arrest for aggravated harassment and terroristic threats." He reached out to grab my injured arm, preparing to violently force me to the marble floor, but I never flinched once. I stared directly into the eyes of the corrupted officer, maintaining absolute silence as I slowly reached my good hand into the pocket of my vintage wool suit. I withdrew my encrypted mobile phone, holding it up for the entire ballroom to see clearly. "You cannot arrest the absolute truth, Chief," I stated, my voice cutting through the chaotic murmuring like a sharpened blade. I firmly pressed a single red command button illuminated on my cracked digital screen, instantly overriding the hotel primary audiovisual network using a backdoor code Thomas had remotely established. The massive projector screens suspended high above the lavish banquet table, which were originally scheduled to display a triumphant corporate merger presentation, violently flickered and aggressively changed channels. The bright, high-definition screens were suddenly flooded with highly classified offshore banking statements, deeply redacted cartel wire transfers, and undeniable visual proof of Sarah's massive money laundering infrastructure, explicitly linking her prestigious real estate developments directly to ruthless narcotic syndicates operating across the southern border. The wealthy foreign investors audibly gasped, pointing frantically at the undeniable mathematical evidence illuminating their enormous impending financial ruin. But the visual exposure was only the preliminary strike. The state-of-the-art surround sound system, seamlessly embedded within the crystal chandeliers, abruptly engaged, emitting a sharp, piercing frequency that forced the elite guests to cover their ears. Then the pristine speakers began broadcasting the crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording I had secretly captured while kneeling in the freezing rain outside her sprawling mansion. Sarah's viciously arrogant voice echoed thunderously across the massive ballroom, dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. A cheap black whore like Jessica never belonged in our world, her recorded voice screamed, vibrating off the expensive marble columns. I am simply cleaning up the garbage. She is going to die, and my son is going to pull the plug. And there is absolutely nothing you or your ghetto family can do about it. The sheer, unimaginable cruelty of her recorded confession hung heavily in the stagnant air, completely paralyzing the entire audience. The elite guests, who had just raised expensive champagne glasses to honor her fictional grief, now stared at Sarah with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. They looked at the elegant woman standing at the head table and saw exactly what she truly was, beneath the emerald green designer gown, a remorseless, cold-blooded murderer who had violently ordered the brutal execution of her own daughter-in-law simply to protect her illegal cartel cash flow. The total realization was absolutely catastrophic. Disgust aggressively rippled through the massive crowd like a violent physical shockwave. The wealthy investors immediately dropped their fine crystal glasses, allowing expensive champagne to spill carelessly across the floor as they frantically scrambled toward the main exit doors, desperately attempting to distance their fragile reputations from her incredibly toxic criminal fallout. Sarah desperately reached out her trembling hands, trying to grab the fleeing investors, begging them to completely ignore the undeniable federal evidence projecting brightly above her head. For her entire privileged existence, Sarah had meticulously maintained a flawless illusion of absolute upper-class superiority. She had constructed a pristine societal shield woven from expensive designer fabrics, inherited generational wealth, and the unearned arrogance of her prejudiced lineage. In her twisted mind, she was a refined aristocrat far above the brutal consequences of the violent criminal underworld she actively profited from. She deeply believed that people like me, working-class black men, who wore faded suits and bore the heavy scars of honest labor, were fundamentally inferior creatures destined only to serve or be discarded. She had brutally mocked my daughter, wielding her immense financial power as an invisible weapon to commit heinous atrocities while keeping her own manicured hands completely clean. But in this exact catastrophic moment, that entire fraudulent facade violently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The sophisticated societal armor she relied upon instantly evaporated, leaving her completely exposed and entirely vulnerable under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the crystal chandeliers. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch of a dominant real estate empire. Without her corrupted bank accounts and her loyal sycophants, she was instantly reduced to her truest elemental form. She was nothing more than a common, ruthless street thug, completely stripped of her expensive camouflage and publicly humiliated before the exact elite peers she so desperately sought to impress. I watched her perfectly curated world violently collapse, observing the sheer absolute terror radiating from her trembling posture. The devastating realization that her infinite money could no longer protect her from the catastrophic legal annihilation I had meticulously orchestrated finally struck her like a physical blow. Her absolute isolation was now completely absolute, as she suddenly found herself standing entirely alone amidst the shattered remnants of her permanently broken, corrupt financial empire tonight. The corrupted police chief realized his lucrative career and his entire freedom were aggressively evaporating alongside Sarah's massive illicit fortune. Knowing his extensive involvement in the cartel money laundering operation was meticulously documented on the massive projector screens projecting brightly behind me, he made a violently desperate tactical decision to aggressively eliminate the primary threat. He abruptly dropped his heavy steel handcuffs and swiftly drew his loaded service weapon, pointing the lethal barrel directly at my unprotected chest. "You are a severely dangerous domestic terrorist, Jerome," he shouted, his voice trembling with sheer unadulterated panic as his finger nervously tightened against the heavy metal trigger. "I am officially neutralizing an active lethal threat to public safety right now. I stared directly down the dark barrel of his pistol, maintaining absolute unwavering stillness, without displaying a single ounce of fear. Before the desperate chief could violently discharge his weapon, the massive panoramic glass windows lining the eastern wall of the grand ballroom forcefully exploded inward, raining thousands of sharp crystalline shards across the pristine marble floor. Over a dozen heavily armed federal agents, clad in thick tactical body armor, aggressively breached the shattered perimeter. Bright red targeting lasers instantly converged directly onto the corrupted police chief's chest, completely neutralizing his pathetic final violent, desperate attack tonight. "Drop your weapon immediately or you will be neutralized right now," a commanding voice echoed through the shattered glass. Thomas strode through the breached perimeter, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear bearing the prominent letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The corrupted police chief instantly realized his massive tactical error. He slowly lowered his service pistol, dropping it onto the marble floor with a heavy metallic clatter. Two agents immediately swarmed him, kicking his legs apart and violently securing his wrists behind his back with thick plastic zip ties. "You are making a huge mistake," the chief stammered, attempting to salvage his completely ruined authority, but the agents simply shoved him toward the exit without uttering a single word. Across the grand ballroom, Ethan was frantically scrambling on his hands and knees beneath the lavish banquet tables. He was desperately attempting to crawl toward the service kitchen doors, hoping to slip away unnoticed in the overwhelming chaos. Thomas spotted his pathetic retreat instantly. My brother crossed the ballroom with heavy, deliberate strides, reaching down and grabbing Ethan roughly by the collar of his expensive tailored tuxedo. He hoisted the terrified man into the air, throwing him violently against a marble pillar. "Please do not hurt me," Ethan sobbed uncontrollably, tears streaming down his pale face. "I will cooperate fully. I will tell you everything you want to know." Thomas shoved Ethan face against the cold stone, pinning his arms securely behind his back, while an agent slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his trembling wrists. "You are going to a federal supermax facility, son," Thomas whispered coldly into his ear. The absolute panic in the room finally settled into a stark, terrifying reality as agents secured the exits, locking down the entire perimeter seamlessly. Sarah stood completely paralyzed behind the ruined head table, watching her only son being aggressively dragged away by federal authorities in heavy iron chains. The pristine emerald green evening gown she wore now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud as the sheer magnitude of her utter defeat finally registered in her arrogant mind. But the deeply ingrained entitlement of her privileged existence refused to surrender without a massive dramatic display of manufactured superiority. She violently slammed her manicured hands down onto the expensive crystal tabletop, shattering a remaining glass and screaming at the top of her lungs. "You cannot do this to me!" she shrieked, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury and absolute indignation. "I am an extremely powerful woman in this city. I demand to speak to my legal team right this very second. Call my attorneys immediately. I will sue every single one of you incompetent thugs for catastrophic damages and completely destroy your miserable little careers." She aggressively pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her eyes blazing with raw, venomous hatred. "And you, Jerome," she roared violently, spitting my name like a vile curse word. "You are going to rot in a dark, miserable prison cell for orchestrating this disgusting, elaborate fabrication. My highly paid lawyers will systematically tear your fake digital evidence into pieces and absolutely bury you alive under a massive mountain of endless litigation. I will financially ruin you and your pathetic injured daughter forever." I did not raise my voice or react to her violent, desperate outburst. I simply stepped closer to the head table, maintaining an incredibly calm and undeniably lethal composure. The room was absolutely silent as every remaining elite guest watched the confrontation unfold with bated breath. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding your current predicament, Sarah," I stated, my voice completely void of any emotional inflection, slicing right through her frantic screaming like a freshly sharpened razor blade. I looked directly into her terrified, widening eyes, stripping away the very last remaining layers of her fragile, manufactured invincibility today. "You keep aggressively threatening me with your vast army of expensive corporate lawyers and your seemingly endless supply of untouchable cartel wealth." I continued, taking another slow, deliberate step forward, until we were separated only by the shattered crystal scattered across the expensive mahogany wood. "But you are completely missing the most crucial mathematical variable in this entire equation right now. Her frantic breathing abruptly hitched as she desperately tried to maintain her aggressive posture. I calmly reached into my dark wool suit jacket and pulled out a thick, certified legal document. "You do not have a single penny left to pay them," I declared coldly, letting the heavy words hang in the stagnant air. "Your entire luxury real estate empire, your hidden offshore banking accounts, and every single illegal holding company you possess are completely eradicated. They have been aggressively seized and legally obliterated by a relentless financial strategy you were too incredibly arrogant to ever possibly anticipate tonight." Sarah shook her head wildly, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality violently crashing down around her. "You are lying," she stammered, her face completely devoid of any color. "That is mathematically impossible. My empire is completely insulated by hundreds of complex corporate firewalls. It is utterly untouchable." I slowly unrolled the heavy legal document, holding it firmly for her to read the damning text. "You built an impressive fraudulent network, Sarah," I explained, utilizing the precise clinical terminology of a veteran forensic accountant, "but you made the fatal mistake of deeply over-leveraging your pristine assets with extremely toxic commercial debt to aggressively fund your cartel laundering operations. You assumed those predatory loans were perfectly safe because you controlled the local banking officials. What you completely failed to realize is that corporate debt can be legally purchased on anonymous secondary markets by anyone wielding enough liquid capital." I lowered the document, my eyes boring into her shattered soul. "My brilliant daughter possessed an untouchable $8 million blind trust fund that you arrogantly failed to discover during your pathetic background checks. I used every single penny of that absolute power to secretly purchase the entirety of your outstanding corporate debt through an aggressive network of untraceable shell companies operated by my ruthless bankruptcy attorney. By acquiring your heavily leveraged debt, I legally became your supreme financial master. I immediately triggered the mandatory repayment clauses, causing an instantaneous default across your entire corporate umbrella. When you failed to magically produce the millions of dollars currently frozen by the federal government, your empire instantly entered involuntary bankruptcy. I legally devoured your entire portfolio. You are completely stripped of your massive inherited wealth, your extensive political leverage, and your powerful legal shield permanently and undeniably forever, starting right now in this very ballroom tonight." Sarah let out a devastating, breathless gasp, stumbling backward until her spine violently hit the edge of the shattered banquet table. Before she could even attempt to physically process the sheer enormity of her catastrophic financial obliteration, a tall, stern man wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped confidently out of the large gathered crowd. He was not a federal agent or a heavily armed police officer, but rather a senior executive director representing the largest institutional commercial bank in the entire state. He carried a sleek black leather portfolio, gripping it with absolute bureaucratic authority. "Sarah," he announced, projecting his loud, steady voice across the completely silenced ballroom so every single remaining wealthy investor could hear him clearly. "Pursuant to the immediate emergency federal injunctions and the finalized hostile bankruptcy acquisitions aggressively executed this evening, I am officially serving you with a certified comprehensive asset seizure mandate right now. Every single physical property listed under your corporate registry, including the very hotel ballroom we are currently standing in, is formally repossessed by your new primary creditor standing right here." He gestured directly toward me, holding the harsh, unyielding legal document high in the air. The absolute final devastating blow had officially landed, securely trapping her permanently tonight in her absolute worst nightmare without escape. The senior banking executive did not lower the certified document. He raised his voice, ensuring every single syllable penetrated the heavy silence of the grand ballroom perfectly. "This comprehensive asset seizure mandate is not pending any judicial review, Sarah," he stated with absolute bureaucratic finality. "It has already been fully authorized by federal bankruptcy courts and officially countersigned by the Department of Justice. The immediate repossession protocol is active right now in this exact second. You have absolutely zero grace period." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom remained firmly guarded by federal agents, effectively turning her lavish celebration into a massive holding cell. The wealthy foreign investors who had eagerly toasted her success just minutes ago now backed away, as if she were carrying a highly contagious plague. She looked wildly around the enormous room, searching for a single friendly face, a corrupted politician, or a paid-off judge to intervene on her behalf today. But they were all staring at the pristine marble floor, desperately avoiding any eye contact to protect their own fragile reputations. The invisible shield of extreme elite privilege she had comfortably worn her entire life evaporated completely. The sheer finality of the executive declaration hung incredibly heavy in the air. The vast empire built on generations of systemic prejudice and violent cartel blood, money was officially eradicated with a few strokes of a judicial pen. The bank executive stepped aside, allowing the federal asset forfeiture team to rapidly advance toward the head table. They carried thick stacks of inventory manifests and heavy plastic evidence bins. Sarah staggered backward, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her pale, terrified face. The immediate destruction of her financial sovereignty was no longer a distant theoretical threat. It was an aggressive reality marching directly toward her tonight completely. A female federal agent stepped directly in front of Sarah, producing a bright fluorescent evidence bag. The agent did not ask for permission. "Take off the diamond necklace," the agent ordered, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "Remove the diamond earrings, the designer watch, and the platinum wedding band immediately. They were purchased using illicit corporate funds and are now officially property of the executing trust." Sarah gasped, clutching her throat in absolute disbelief, as if the agent had physically struck her. "You cannot take my personal jewelry!" she screamed frantically, stepping back against the wall. "This is a massive violation of my rights." The agent simply signaled to another officer, who stepped forward, grabbing Sarah's arms and forcefully unclasping the heavy diamond necklace from her trembling neck. The extremely expensive jewels dropped into the plastic evidence bag with an unceremonious plastic thud. The officers efficiently stripped her of every single piece of glittering wealth she wore, pulling the platinum rings aggressively off her perfectly manicured fingers. "Your pristine, sprawling mansion has already been entirely secured and permanently locked down by federal marshals," Thomas announced loudly, stepping forward so his booming voice carried across the dead silent room. "Your entire fleet of luxury imported vehicles was actively towed from your driveway 20 minutes ago. The massive primary bank accounts controlling your daily operational expenses have been completely drained to precisely zero. You do not own the ground you are currently standing on. You do not own the expensive silk bed sheets you plan to sleep on tonight. Even the expensive emerald green evening gown you are currently wearing legally belongs to my brother now." Sarah looked down at her bare, trembling hands, her chest heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Her entire identity was intrinsically tied to the immense, staggering wealth she had just violently lost. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, leaning in closely so she could completely absorb the absolute lethal gravity of my words. "You looked at my brilliant daughter and arrogantly told her that we do not belong in your perfect, pristine world," I stated, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadly whisper. "You believed your inherited privilege gave you the absolute supreme authority to ruthlessly murder my child and discard my family like common trash." I watched the remaining color completely drain from her hollow, terrified face as my harsh words struck her arrogant soul like a physical sledgehammer. "You are absolutely right, Sarah," I continued, pointing a weathered finger directly at her chest. "We definitely do not belong in a world built entirely on violent cartel blood money and vicious systemic prejudice, but you no longer belong in it either. I purchased your entire corrupt universe tonight, and I am permanently evicting you from the premises immediately. Now you are the homeless one." The sheer, devastating reality of my final statement completely broke her fragile mental foundation instantly. She collapsed heavily onto her knees, sobbing uncontrollably onto the cold marble floor. The profound psychological devastation radiating from Sarah, kneeling in total disgrace, provided the ultimate vindication for every marginalized individual she had ever cruelly oppressed. For her entire existence, she had ruthlessly operated under the deeply flawed assumption that infinite wealth could permanently shield her from basic human accountability. She had brutally wielded her massive financial power to silence whistleblowers, evict struggling families from their homes, and ultimately command the horrific execution of my brilliant daughter without shedding a single tear. She firmly believed that the American justice system was merely a convenient tool reserved strictly for punishing the poor while enthusiastically protecting the elite. By orchestrating this massive corporate seizure, I did not simply send her to federal prison. Incarceration alone would have allowed her to maintain her fierce, arrogant pride and her highly inflated societal status among other wealthy criminals. I aggressively stripped her of the only tangible identity she truly valued. When she woke up tomorrow morning in a freezing concrete holding cell, she would not be a fallen real estate queen or a powerful political donor facing temporary legal hurdles. She would be an absolutely destitute, bankrupt individual, completely stripped of her inherited power, completely erased from the elite social registry, and entirely dependent on the exact same taxpayer-funded public defender system she had mocked her entire life. Her total absolute humiliation was brilliantly showcased under the bright crystal chandeliers, serving as a permanent, agonizing reminder that no amount of dirty cartel money could ever successfully combat the relentless, furious intellect of a grieving father. She was officially reduced to absolute nothingness tonight, completely drowning in the agonizing reality of her own catastrophic failures, while the entire world actively watched her final spectacular ruin unfold right here perfectly tonight before their very own eyes, completely forever. As Sarah continued sobbing helplessly on the cold marble floor, a sudden violent commotion erupted near the shattered ballroom exit. Ethan, who was still firmly pinned against the heavy stone pillar by Thomas, and the federal agent suddenly broke his terrified silence. His sheer, overwhelming desperation to survive completely overrode any lingering shred of familial loyalty he possessed. He began thrashing wildly against his heavy steel handcuffs, screaming frantically at the lead federal prosecutor who had just entered the chaotic scene. "I want full federal immunity," Ethan shrieked, his voice echoing over his mother, pathetic weeping. "I will give you everything you need. My mother is the sole mastermind behind the entire cartel laundering operation. She forced me to inject Jessica in the woods. She planned the entire murder. I have explicit recorded conversations and hidden backup files to prove she orchestrated every single illegal transaction. I will testify against her in open court right now for a heavily reduced sentence." Hearing her own son aggressively volunteer to violently throw her under the federal bus instantly snapped Sarah out of her temporary shock. "You disgusting, treacherous little coward," she roared furiously, attempting to lunge at Ethan before the agents aggressively slammed her back down onto the cold floor, ending her entire treacherous legacy completely tonight. The federal agents easily overpowered Sarah, pressing her face firmly against the cold marble floor. Her pristine makeup was entirely ruined, smeared across her cheeks with tears of absolute venomous fury. She thrashed wildly against the heavy boots of the officers, screaming obscenities that echoed violently through the silent ballroom. "I gave you everything, you ungrateful, pathetic little worm," she roared at Ethan, her voice cracking with pure animalistic rage. "I built this massive empire from the ground up to protect your worthless future. I covered up your constant, massive failures. You would be absolutely nothing without my money and my protection." Ethan shrank back against the heavy stone pillar, refusing to make eye contact with the terrifying woman who had controlled his entire pathetic existence. "I am not going to spend the rest of my life rotting in a federal penitentiary because of your psychotic obsession with that dead girl mother," Ethan yelled back, his voice trembling with sheer cowardly panic. "You made me inject her. You forced my hand." The federal prosecutor simply nodded to his tactical team, capturing every single desperate admission of absolute guilt. Sarah realized her complete lack of control. She began hyperventilating, her chest heaving as the agents violently yanked her back onto her feet. "You are a traitor to your own bloodline," she shrieked, spitting viciously toward her trembling son. "I will absolutely make sure you suffer every single day of your pathetic, miserable life. You will beg for mercy." Her frantic threats were entirely meaningless now. The impenetrable fortress of arrogant privilege she had spent decades meticulously constructing was utterly demolished. She was completely broken, violently betrayed by the only person she ever truly valued entirely, reduced to a pathetic, screaming criminal facing absolute, undeniable justice tonight right now, forever completely destroyed. The tactical agents aggressively marched Sarah and Ethan toward the shattered main entrance of the grand ballroom, dragging them away like common street criminals. The heavy steel chains around their wrists clinked loudly against the pristine marble floors, providing a grim, rhythmic soundtrack to their total, absolute humiliation. Sarah continued fighting wildly against the strong grip of the federal officers, her expensive emerald green evening gown tearing slightly at the shoulder seam as she desperately tried to break free from her inescapable captors. She violently twisted her neck to cast one final terrifying look of pure, unadulterated hatred toward me, but the aggressive agent simply pushed her head forward completely, ignoring her pathetic aristocratic outrage. Ethan did not resist at all. He kept his head entirely bowed, sobbing uncontrollably into his chest, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying realization that his luxurious, privileged lifestyle was permanently finished. As the heavy oak doors violently slammed shut behind them, the overwhelming chaotic energy in the massive ballroom instantly evaporated, leaving behind a stark, heavy silence. The elite wealthy guests who had remained frozen in absolute terror during the aggressive raid now began quickly scattering toward the secondary emergency exits. The powerful foreign investors who had eagerly sought to finalize the massive cartel merger actively hid their faces, avoiding any possible eye contact with the remaining federal personnel. They were absolutely terrified that their own pristine reputations would be permanently destroyed by the massive radioactive fallout of Sarah's horrific criminal exposure. Within exactly 4 minutes, the entire lavish banquet hall was completely empty of its original arrogant occupants. Only the heavily armed federal agents Thomas Mitchell and I remained standing amidst the incredible glittering wreckage. The expensive crystal champagne flutes lay shattered across the floor, mixed with spilled wine and discarded luxury items. I stood completely motionless in the dead center of the massive room, adjusting the lapels of my faded charcoal gray wool suit with my uninjured right hand. My posture was perfectly straight, completely unburdened by the immense crushing weight of sorrow and vengeance I had carried tirelessly for weeks. I took a deep, slow breath of the stagnant air, completely processing the absolute magnitude of what we had just successfully accomplished tonight. I did not violently scream in victory or aggressively celebrate my absolute dominance over the treacherous people who had brutally tried to murder my only child. True power does not require loud, arrogant validation. I simply stood there, completely rooted in my quiet working-class dignity, staring down at the discarded emerald necklace resting inside the plastic evidence bag on the ruined banquet table. The terrifying apex predators who had aggressively hunted my family were now securely locked in federal cages, and I was the undeniable architect of their complete, total obliteration. I had successfully wielded the absolute heaviest legal and financial hammer available, entirely crushing their evil legacy into permanent, meaningless dust right here tonight. They were permanently removed from the sophisticated world they had violently stolen forever. Mitchell stepped forward carefully, navigating through the sharp, broken glass scattered across the previously immaculate floor. The ruthless corporate bankruptcy attorney looked down at the physical manifestations of Sarah's seized wealth before turning his intense gaze directly toward me. His usually cold, strictly professional demeanor was completely replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. I have spent my entire long career aggressively dismantling massive corrupt corporations and executing hostile takeovers, Mitchell stated, his voice incredibly quiet but vibrating with absolute, genuine respect. But I have never witnessed a single man systematically eradicate an entire generational empire with such terrifying, flawless precision. You did not just bankrupt her, Jerome. You entirely erased her entire absolute existence from the financial registry. Thomas walked up beside us, securely resting his hand on his tactical holster, letting out a long, slow breath of relief. That is what happens when you arrogantly attempt to murder an innocent girl and carelessly trigger the wrath of the smartest forensic accountant in federal history. Thomas chuckled darkly. They stupidly believed they were playing a simple game of checkers while my brother was violently executing a flawless game of lethal chess. I looked at both men, completely acknowledging their vital assistance in securing this massive, monumental victory. I could not have successfully executed this precise financial decapitation without your immediate aggressive legal maneuvering, Mitchell, as I stated sincerely. You completely severed her critical monetary arteries exactly when I requested. Mitchell simply shook his head, crossing his arms firmly over his tailored suit jacket. You handed me the ultimate weapon, Jerome, he replied, pointing at the massive digital screen still glowing brightly above us. You possess the profound, ruthless intellect to accurately locate her weakest structural foundation and the sheer absolute willpower to violently strike it. You are a genius. The immediate chaotic aftermath of the Grand Gala raid aggressively dominated national news cycles for several uninterrupted weeks. The incredibly pristine reputation of Sarah's massive luxury real estate empire was permanently reduced to highly toxic criminal garbage. 6 long, grueling months rapidly passed since that fateful, terrifying night inside the hotel ballroom. I spent those necessary quiet months completely focused on safely relocating my recovering daughter and heavily assisting the federal prosecution team in securely cementing their ironclad case against her former treacherous family. The extensive, overwhelming mountain of pristine forensic evidence I had meticulously provided completely guaranteed an incredibly swift and utterly devastating legal victory for the federal government. There were absolutely no expensive plea deals actively offered to the primary masterminds behind the brutal attempted assassination of my child. Today was the final scheduled sentencing hearing, marking the absolute ultimate conclusion of their spectacular downfall. I stood quietly adjusting my crisp, dark suit, perfectly preparing to aggressively face the very same people who had arrogantly tried to violently erase my entire existence. The ultimate final judgment was rapidly approaching, ensuring permanent, absolute destruction today. I walked slowly toward the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse, ready to finally witness the absolute legal obliteration of the evil monsters who hurt my little girl. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse, stepping into the cavernous room where the final chapter of this brutal saga would be officially written. The air conditioning hummed quietly, but the atmosphere was incredibly thick, saturated with the heavy weight of impending absolute justice. I walked slowly down the center aisle, finding my reserved seat in the front row directly behind the prosecution table. Thomas sat firmly beside me, offering a silent nod of profound solidarity. Across the polished wooden barrier sat the two individuals who had arrogantly attempted to completely erase my daughter from existence. Sarah and Ethan no longer resembled the untouchable elite real estate royalty they once pretended to be. They were both wearing identical, oversized, bright orange prison jumpsuits that completely washed out their pale, terrified complexions. The expensive designer fabrics and perfectly tailored silhouettes they previously used as armor were permanently replaced by cheap, scratchy cotton explicitly designed to strip away any remaining shred of individuality. Ethan sat slumped forward, his shoulders completely hunched in absolute defeat. His hair was heavily unkempt and his wrists were securely bound by heavy steel chains linked directly to a thick leather belly chain. He refused to look anywhere except at the scuffed floorboards beneath his slip-on canvas shoes. Sarah, however, sat rigidly straight, completely attempting to maintain a pathetic illusion of aristocratic dignity despite her humiliating physical restraints. Her pristine makeup was permanently gone, revealing deep, dark circles and harsh, aggressive lines etched deeply into her aging face by 6 agonizing months of brutal federal incarceration. When she heard my heavy boots step into the front row, she slowly turned her head. For a brief second, our eyes completely locked across the absolutely dead, silent, and incredibly massive federal courtroom environment together today. The honorable federal judge entered the vast courtroom, his black robes flowing with absolute undeniable authority. Everyone rose immediately in silent respect before taking their seats for the ultimate final pronouncement. The judge did not waste a single moment on unnecessary pleasantries. He adjusted his reading glasses and stared aggressively down at the two broken defendants, completely destroying their final pathetic hopes for any judicial leniency today. Ethan, you actively participated in a highly sophisticated transnational money laundering syndicate and directly executed a violent, premeditated attempted murder against your own wife, the judge stated, his voice echoing powerfully off the high vaulted ceilings. Because you aggressively cooperated with federal prosecutors and explicitly testified against your co-conspirator, I am officially sentencing you to 40 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Ethan completely collapsed forward violently, sobbing into his chained hands as the reality of spending his entire remaining adult life inside a freezing concrete cage completely shattered his fragile mind. The judge then aggressively shifted his piercing gaze directly onto Sarah, who immediately stiffened her posture in a desperate final act of sheer arrogant defiance. Sarah, you are the absolute, undisputed mastermind behind this massive, violent criminal enterprise. The judge continued, his tone dropping to a level of profound, undisguised disgust. You violently ordered the brutal execution of an innocent young woman simply to protect your illegal cartel financial infrastructure. You represent the absolute worst parasitic elements of corporate greed and extreme malicious prejudice. For your undeniable role in directing these horrific atrocities and actively managing a lethal narcotic financial pipeline, I am officially sentencing you to serve the remainder of your natural life in a federal supermax prison. You will never breathe a single breath of free air ever again. Sarah violently gasped, her chest heaving aggressively as the heavy gavel slammed down with a deafening, terrifying crack, permanently sealing her inescapable doom. As the heavy steel chains rattled loudly, signaling the armed bailiffs to aggressively escort the convicted felons away, Sarah violently twisted her body around to face me directly. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, burning with pure, unadulterated venom. I did not smile or mock her total destruction. Instead, I slowly and deliberately reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small vintage wooden music box that had successfully contained the ultimate digital evidence of her massive ruin. I held it up high, gripping the polished wood firmly so she could clearly see the exact instrument of her total catastrophic failure completely. The beautiful, delicate object that she had arrogantly dismissed as a cheap, sentimental piece of working-class garbage had ultimately been the exact powerful weapon used to violently decapitate her entire multi-million-dollar operation. She stared at the small wooden box, her entire face aggressively contorting into an incredibly ugly mask of profound, absolute defeat, completely forever experiencing total, true justice directly within this massive, formal legal room, exactly as she entirely, ultimately, unequivocally deserved. The pure, venomous hatred violently radiating from her terrifying gaze was absolutely meant to severely intimidate me, but it was entirely powerless against the profound, unyielding armor of a father, deep protective love. For her entire arrogant, privileged existence, Sarah had foolishly believed that infinite amounts of stolen dirty money and systemic elite prejudice could seamlessly eradicate any working-class family that dared to challenge her supreme aristocratic authority. She had brutally looked at my brilliant, innocent daughter and aggressively seen nothing more than a highly disposable, inconvenient obstacle standing directly in the way of her massive, illicit financial ambitions. She tragically failed to understand that the unbreakable spiritual bond between a devoted father and his cherished child represents an incredibly powerful, ancient force that no amount of corrupted generational wealth can ever successfully suppress or destroy. Evelyn and I had spent 4 long decades meticulously teaching Jessica the profound absolute value of hard, honest work, deep moral integrity, and incredibly fierce resilience. We deliberately instilled within her an ironclad internal strength that directly allowed her to bravely stand up against the terrifying cartel laundering network entirely alone in the very beginning. That simple vintage wooden music box I held firmly in my hand was not merely a convenient hiding place for heavily encrypted federal evidence. It was the absolute, undeniable physical manifestation of our entire family enduring spirit. It completely symbolized the exact, quiet, formidable strength of marginalized people who refuse to be violently silenced or casually discarded by the arrogant, corrupt elites who mistakenly believe they own the world completely. Sarah's viciously hateful glare slowly evaporated into a blank, empty stare of total realization as she finally understood she had been utterly defeated by the profound, authentic love she had so deeply despised forever throughout her life, completely. The armed federal bailiffs aggressively grabbed Sarah strictly by her bright orange shoulders, forcefully marching her toward the heavy, secure holding doors located at the absolute rear of the massive courtroom. The heavy, thick steel hinges aggressively groaned as the large, terrifying portal was violently pulled open, actively revealing a cold, dark cinder block hallway completely devoid of any natural sunlight or remaining human hope. The heavy metallic clatter of her thick iron shackles aggressively echoed across the entirely silent room, serving as a brutal, rhythmic reminder of her permanently revoked freedom. With one final devastating shove, the heavy steel door violently slammed shut, completely sealing her safely inside the unforgiving federal penal system for the absolute remainder of her miserable, pathetic natural existence forever. The deafening, aggressive slam aggressively reverberated through the very floorboards, officially declaring the absolute permanent end of her treacherous, bloody dynasty. A profound, completely new, unshakable order was immediately and permanently established today. The terrifying, invisible monsters who had aggressively hunted my innocent family in the freezing, dark woods were finally eradicated, completely restoring an incredibly peaceful silence to our massively disrupted lives forever. Thomas placed his heavy hand securely on my shoulder, signaling that our brutal, relentless, violent mission was officially and perfectly concluded today, exactly now, permanently, completely. The heavy steel door of the federal courthouse was permanently closed, sealing away the toxic nightmare that had violently disrupted our lives. The transition from that dark, echoing legal chamber to our current reality felt like waking up from a decade-long, suffocating dream. Today, the late afternoon sun painted the pristine, manicured lawns of our sprawling new estate in brilliant shades of warm gold and soft amber. This magnificent ultra-luxury mansion nestled deep within the most exclusive gated community in the state once served as the primary crown jewel of Sarah Arrogant real estate empire. During the massive aggressive federal asset forfeiture auction coordinated perfectly by Mitchell, I utilized a fraction of the $8 million blind trust to legally purchase the entire sprawling property for pennies on the dollar. It was the ultimate profound poetic justice. The sprawling estate that was originally financed by violent cartel blood money and maintained through vicious systemic prejudice had been thoroughly cleansed and entirely reclaimed. We completely remodeled the vast interior, aggressively stripping away every single piece of pretentious gaudy decor that represented her fake aristocratic lineage. The dark, oppressive mahogany walls were painted bright, welcoming colors. The heavy, suffocating velvet drapes were completely thrown out, allowing pure, natural sunlight to flood every single room of the massive house. It was no longer a cold, isolated fortress built on corruption and lies. It was a warm, thriving sanctuary built entirely on profound resilience and unyielding familial love. The quiet atmosphere was incredibly peaceful, broken only by the gentle rustling of the ancient oak trees swaying softly in the comfortable spring breeze. The terrifying apex predators were permanently locked away in their freezing concrete cages, leaving us to completely enjoy the absolute serene tranquility of the exact pristine world they had arrogantly tried to violently banish us from, forever, starting completely today right now. I stepped out onto the expansive custom-built wooden patio, taking a deep, refreshing breath of the crisp, clean air. I firmly gripped the ergonomic rubber handles of Jessica's state-of-the-art medical wheelchair, carefully guiding her down the smoothly paved stone pathway that gracefully snaked through the sprawling botanical gardens. The intensive physical therapy regimen was absolutely grueling, but my brilliant daughter was remarkably fighting her way back to full mobility with the exact same fierce, relentless determination that had initially driven her to aggressively confront Ethan about his massive cartel laundering operations. She was wearing a comfortable light blue sweater, her beautiful natural hair blowing freely in the gentle wind, completely unbothered by the cruel, racist judgments of a high society elite that no longer existed. Her physical wounds were significantly healing, and the bright, intelligent spark had undeniably returned to her beautiful dark eyes. "You know, Dad," she said softly, leaning her head back against the comfortable padded headrest of her wheelchair. "I honestly never thought I would be able to peacefully look at these massive garden oak trees again without feeling completely terrified." I gently squeezed her shoulder reassuringly as we continued our slow, steady walk past the blooming, vibrant rose bushes. "You never have to be terrified of anything in this world, ever again, Jessica," I promised her, my voice radiating absolute, unwavering certainty. "We completely removed the monsters from the woods. This entire beautiful kingdom belongs entirely to you now." She reached up and placed her warm, soft hand directly over my own, gently tracing the thick, raised burn scars covering my left forearm. A profound, silent understanding passed seamlessly between us, completely acknowledging the extreme, brutal violence we had been forced to aggressively navigate to reach this exact peaceful moment. Up ahead on the sprawling custom patio, Thomas was aggressively tending to a massive professional-grade stainless steel barbecue grill. The incredibly rich, savory aroma of heavily seasoned ribs and perfectly smoked brisket wafted beautifully through the warm evening air, completely overriding the scent of the blooming garden flowers. My brother was wearing a completely ridiculous bright yellow cooking apron over his faded tactical shirt, humming a classic soul tune while expertly flipping thick cuts of meat with a pair of heavy iron tongs. "Hey, Jerome!" Thomas shouted, waving a large metal spatula enthusiastically in the air. "You better wheel my favorite niece over here right now before I accidentally eat this entire beautiful brisket completely by myself." Jessica let out a loud, vibrant, genuine laugh that instantly warmed my entire soul. It was a completely pure, authentic sound, entirely devoid of the heavy, suffocating anxiety she had endured during her highly abusive, toxic marriage. I pushed her wheelchair closer to the lively patio, joining my brother as he proudly served plates piled high with delicious, perfectly cooked food. We sat together around the large outdoor dining table, completely surrounded by lush, vibrant greenery and absolute unbroken peace, enjoying a magnificent family feast. I sat quietly at the head of the large wooden table watching my beautiful daughter actively enjoy a simple, delicious meal with her incredibly devoted uncle. As she smiled vibrantly, my eyes drifted downward, focusing intently on the thick, heavily textured burn scars permanently etched into the dark skin of my left forearm. The incredibly severe physical pain I had willingly endured inside my blazing home was a relatively minor, insignificant price to pay for the absolute total salvation of my only beloved child. Throughout my incredibly long, relentless career hunting dangerous, sophisticated criminals, I always strictly believed that justice could be entirely achieved through meticulous paperwork, pristine audit trails, and highly aggressive federal indictments. I had fundamentally operated under the deeply naive assumption that the powerful elite class secretly respected the structural boundaries of civilized legal warfare. Sarah and Ethan violently shattered that peaceful illusion the exact moment they maliciously ordered the brutal physical execution of my vulnerable daughter in those freezing, dark woods. They explicitly demonstrated that incredibly wealthy corrupted predators will aggressively cross any conceivable moral boundary when their massive illicit financial empires are directly threatened by a resilient outsider. That tragic, terrifying realization forced me to completely evolve my operational parameters. I was utterly compelled to physically and mentally transform into an absolutely terrifying, destructive force. I willingly burned my own sentimental past to absolute ash, specifically so I could seamlessly navigate their dark, vicious underworld without carrying any exploitable emotional vulnerabilities. I brutally weaponized my massive, lifelong financial intellect to entirely eradicate their immense generational power structures without displaying a single microscopic ounce of mercy or regret. Looking at Jessica today, I felt a profound, immense surge of absolute vindication. The incredibly deep scars wrapping tightly around my arm were not merely a stark reminder of extreme violent trauma. They were the ultimate, undeniable physical badges of a father, absolute, unconditional, unyielding, protective love. They represented the permanent, enduring strength of a marginalized family that aggressively refused to be quietly discarded by a highly prejudiced elite system. We survived the brutal flames, we conquered the ruthless monsters. We permanently secured our righteous freedom, and we completely rebuilt our beautiful, peaceful reality exactly on our own powerful, uncompromising, formidable terms tonight, forever together, always triumphantly, completely, undeniably, eternally, victorious today, profoundly, securely, powerfully, beautifully, faithfully, perfectly, successfully, permanently, truly, boldly, proudly, definitively, right here, right now. As the sun finally dipped entirely beneath the distant horizon, painting the entire evening sky in brilliant, magnificent strokes of vibrant, deep purple and bright, fiery orange, I gently placed my scarred hand over my daughter's wheelchair handles again. I looked at the incredible, sprawling estate we had aggressively conquered and peacefully reclaimed. My father once told me the only way to effectively fight against those who arrogantly think you do not belong in their pristine, exclusive world is to simply purchase that entire world completely and violently kick them out into the cold, unforgiving streets. And looking at our beautiful new reality today, I can confidently, absolutely proudly say that is exactly without a single microscopic doubt what we undeniably, flawlessly, permanently did absolutely forever, completely right here today. If there is one final lesson to take away from all this, it is that true power does not reside in massive bank accounts or inherited privilege. People who hide behind their expensive suits and corrupted connections eventually forget how to survive in the real world. They dangerously underestimate the quiet strength of those they deem beneath them. Intelligence, patience, and a fierce, unconditional love will always outmaneuver arrogant greed. Never let anyone convince you that you are powerless just because you do not fit into their pristine mold. Real power is knowing exactly how to strike back when the time is right. If you found strength in my story today, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled these absolute monsters.